Shawn grills Ben for an hour, maybe multiple hours, about his projections. That's what we're doing today on Stealing Videos. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find off his great work over at RotoViz. Shawn, we've been drafting some together. Definitely going to be ramping that up. You've had a chance now to dig around on my projections a little bit. You've asked me some little questions here and there, but you've told me you have some notes and some things that you're curious about where I landed on things. I've commented on the show that I love that feedback. I think it's so cool to have somebody that's interested in your work and looking at it, and obviously whose opinion I respect as much as yours, that gives me some reason to consider whether, my final projections were too high on some players, things like that. You mentioned David Njoku during our draft last night, and I think I mentioned to you after the show, but I was thinking, I'm probably a little too high on David Njoku. Maybe I talked about that on the stream as well, but just getting those things where it's like, I'm probably a little bit off here, a little bit off there. I talked about this a little bit in a recent post at my newsletter that, each team I have a minimum, I think it was, I added up, of 104 inputs that I put in. Some of those are pretty not very meaningful. They're efficiency stuff on players that are not actually getting a lot of usage or what have you. But there's a ton of those that are, going to be pretty impactful to the overall team projection. And sometimes I'm just missing something. I actually caught a typo on a wide receiver 5 for the Patriots, where I had moved a decimal point over once. This was the note that I sent out to Stealing Signals subscribers. And it brought down Drake May's yards per attempt by like 0.3, that's where I noticed it. I was like, man, I projected May kind of low. And I started digging in a little bit, and I was like, oh man, I have their wide receiver 5 projected for 0.8 yards per target, which is not very good. And anyway, the point being that there's a lot of these different things. I'm hopeful that I don't make a lot of those types of mistakes. I went through and checked all of the final outputs to look for anything like that stood out, these, significant yards per target or yards per attempt changes. I didn't see anything else. Sent out a note to the subscribers that, I had updated that, but it was also as I went and looked at it, I noticed some other things that I didn't love about the Drake May projection that I mentioned, to subscribers. Like, for example, I had regressed his yards per carry, which were very high last year at 7.8 down to 5.8. which is maybe fine, but I was comparing him to Caleb Williams as I started to look at it a little bit. Williams had a strong yards per carry last year as well of 6.0, but I had only regressed him down to 5.8. I thought that was interesting. I basically said that they both were going to be a 5.8 yards per carry guy when Drake May had shown an ability of scrambling the ball of being nearly 2 yards per carry better in their respective rookie seasons. Probably that's not me being consistent with what I actually think about their true skill in that regard. And so anyway, as I had started to dissect Drake May a little bit more, I was like, man, I must have been a little tired when I did the Patriots projection, because there's a couple things here that I maybe didn't do as well as I'd like to do. The point is, it's impossible to do 100-something, pull 100 different levers on 32 different teams and not have some of those things exist. I have no shortage of concern or no qualms about the idea that you may find some things that are going to be very wrong here. So I'm thrilled about it. I'm excited for you to ask me. And then, of course, obviously the projections for me are more about the research and understanding a lot of these different things. Like Drake May is an efficient scrambler in his rookie season, which he thought he might be, but he was, and we saw that, and it's there in the numbers. And so that's something that comes out of the projection process just as much as the output does. I'm not trying to dial in these outputs and make them perfect. And so some of the cases may be that I just moved quickly through that space or whatever, but I'm really excited to get your thoughts and some of your questions. And that's basically going to be the basis of the show today. So how you doing?
Awesome. It's always so fun to, like you mentioned, you do your own work and then you're like, well, I feel like I'm too close to this, have too much familiarity, going in circles is not going to. And then you get a chance to look at something that is just so deep research from somebody else. And especially somebody else, I think it's many times more helpful to see what someone who thinks somewhat parallel to you, as opposed to people who look at things completely differently. I do want to mention Kevin has done an amazing job doing the 32 team breakdown at RotoViz. You can get tons and tons of deep information there using both all of our tools and the sports info solutions numbers. But Ben, as we go through this today, I do have notes on basically every team, but I'm going to kind of focus on two things. One are areas where something jumped out where I actually do have kind of a meaningfully different number, at least in terms of what my rankings imply for a certain piece, or teams that are fascinating, right? We have teams at the very top end, these teams that are very, very good. And I even mentioned this as it related to the Bengals in my big Kansas City piece, that it's not that there aren't plenty of scenarios that could occur for the Bengals, but they're fairly straightforward what they would be and how they would be priced. You have teams like the Eagles, like the Ravens. I think that those teams are at least somewhat similar. It's not that there aren't plenty of discussions you can have on those teams as well. But in terms of trying to figure out with some time constraints where to go, then we also have teams at the low end. We've actually spent a decent amount of time on the show talking about the Jets. They're probably not like that interesting, really. We have teams like the Saints. They're probably not that interesting. Even a team like the Pittsburgh Steelers. I thought that your target share for DK Metcalf was probably low, but I'm like, I just am not also interested in that. I don't think that Steelers are going to be that relevant. On the flip side of things, and we have some teams that are really fun. And I want to start with the Denver Broncos. We really liked Bo Nix last year. That hit. He's now pretty expensive, which is, I think, interesting since there is so much uncertainty for this team. Almost anything could happen, right? So I wanted to start out with really two different pieces, both on projecting the rush side and projecting the pass side. Actually, let's make it simple. Let's start out with an easy one that also kind of goes to this process, right? Which is that when you go through and you're projecting the main guys, you also have this element of like how much really peripheral, apparently meaningless, but still actual volume gets sloughed off to people where on some teams we know the names and on some teams we probably don't. And when you know the names, because they're relevant players, then it is a little bit more likely that they factor in. Whereas if a team has no depth, then there is that possibility for an extreme concentration, but it's also just possible, if not likely, that players who seem irrelevant now are going to soak up a little bit of the work. It doesn't end up being
Yeah.
relevant, but it does change the projection if you don't give those guys any work. And so as I'm looking at this, like how likely is it that we get a combined 15% rush share for Estime and McLaughlin? This is within the context of you having pretty good numbers for RJ Harvey and JK Dobbins. When I say good numbers, they're going to both factor in also as receivers, which is something I want to talk about in a minute. But both from a process perspective, and then for these two guys who really do look, at least we hope, are going to be buried as the third and fourth options, how should we be looking at this?
Oh, I think that's a great way of framing it. I didn't know that's where you were going to go. I love with the specific question about Estime and McLaughlin. While we're just getting onto our first team, I love the point you just made, and I just want to emphasize it and completely agree with it. That this is one of the reasons that I don't look at my projections output as an end all be all. In addition to the fact that there are going to be some minor issues, I just clicked over to Pittsburgh when you mentioned the DK Metcalf thing, and I have a 22.2% target share, and I was looking at that like that's definitely low. I don't know why I landed on that. I think it's in part because I have both Pat Freiermuth and Jonnu Smith at a 13.4%. I think they're both going to get some solid work as the number two tight ends, or number two receiving options as both, being tight ends there. But I don't know why I would have had Metcalf where I do. And I agree. I like immediately was like, that should be at least multiple points higher. He hasn't necessarily had massive target shares over his career, but there's no reason why that should be as low as I have it. Just a straightforward one that when I did that projection, I obviously did not recognize, and I didn't recognize in the total output that he was ranked lower, in part because I knew that I was low on Pittsburgh's total play volume and pass rate and all these things. So it didn't necessarily surprise me that Metcalf only came out with 121 targets, but probably even within the context of this offense, I should have a projection that has him at 130 or more. Anyway, I do think that's a very interesting point. Denver, and so it gets to this point of you're talking about the secondary players and how certain we can be about a projection. And some of them I feel confident the secondary players are not going to steal from the top guys in any kind of meaningful way. And just getting to my process, in most cases, I'm looking at the top guys first and then working down, because the top guys tend to get the volume first, and then you figure out what's left for everybody else. But which I basically did not do a good enough job of with Pittsburgh is what I'm acknowledging. Having said that, in some cases, I do project more volume for the secondary pieces, and it probably doesn't get to. I love the point you said about some, like, I may not project a lot of volume to secondary pieces in some cases, but it could come from anywhere. It could be somebody that we don't know yet. I try to still project some volume to like some name that I don't even necessarily think is good, which basically just accounts for like a placeholder in those instances. Denver's a unique one because Sean Payton's history includes a lot of usage to the later guys. If you go look at, for example, the Denver Pro Football Reference page from last year and just like sort by rush attempts and sort by targets and look at how much volume went to different names throughout a Sean Payton season, it's a long list of a lot of different names that saw meaningful volume, even down to like whatever. Their fullback Michael Burton had 10 targets last year and 7 rush attempts. That doesn't seem like a ton, but you don't usually have like he's like the 15th dude on the team that has, he's 13th in targets that has 10 plus targets. You don't usually have, he's got 4 tight ends above that and a fullback, multiple running backs, 6 receivers. We'll get to the pass game. This is the most spread out I have in any pass game, but that's because of some numbers, we've talked about, I think, Sean, where Cortland Sutton led the team in routes by a mile and in targets by a mile. Second on the team was Javonte Williams at 70 targets. Third on the team was Devon Vele at 55. They had 4 receivers between 45 and 55 that were basically all tied, roughly tied, for that like second target share among non-running backs for wide receivers or tight ends, because you have Javonte Williams at 70% or at 70 targets and the second target share overall. But they were all between 196 and 315 routes, those 4 players, and they all played at least 13 games. 3 of them played 16 plus games. It's Vele and Marvin Mims and Troy Franklin and Lil Jordan Humphrey. We talked about this a little bit on a recent draft, or during a recent draft, when I expressed some concern over Marvin Mims' role and how it could really expand and what that means. Anyway. Oh, I also have a little note here that just to circle that point, because it's not what you asked about, but there were 9 regular season games where all 4 were active, and in all 9, each ran at least 20% of the routes. While you have Sutton at a meaningful like wide receiver 1 role, you have 4 other receivers running at least 20%. That's not a nothing route share for the wide receiver 5 to be running. And then those 4 receivers combined for only 3 individual games that were over 65% routes in those situations. So you're in this like 20 to 65% band when they're all healthy, or that's the way it looked. And then they add Pat Bryant, they add Evan Ingram, and it just feels more confusing. But as far as the running backs, I do think that was a good place to start, Sean, because I don't think that I would stick to that. I think last year we got 4 running backs. Well, Tyler Bidet only got 11 carries, but was starting to get used a little bit. I mentioned the fullback got 7 carries. Blake Watson gets 4. That's sort of the RB4 situation. Estime had 76 carries behind. Javonte leads the team with 139 and Jaleel with 113. And I think just looking at Jaleel's rush share last year and Estime's rush share last year that gets them to 113 and 76, their own individual numbers is probably why I still gave Estime 8.6% of the carries and Jaleel McLaughlin 5.8%, but that's not a number that my RB4 is ever really getting. I mean, he's at 3% or lower in almost all my other projections. It's probably just trying to be a little bit fair to Estime and McLaughlin and what their profiles were and how much they were used last year, and that they may get some situational usage, and maybe Estime gets a couple games where the Broncos have put a team away and he gets some carries late in the game because, Sean Payton's used that sort of closer runner in the past. Maybe McLaughlin gets some situational usage. It would basically be in like non-competitive situations that I think these guys are getting usage. But to your point, that can happen in other projections as well, that I'm probably not allocating well enough to the RB3 and the RB4 across the league. And so from a projection standpoint, I would agree with you completely that my RJ Harvey and J.K. Dobbins projections from a rush perspective combined to be low from what I expect from them, because they went out and acquired these guys. They made a point this offseason to let the guy they played a ton of snaps overestimated McLaughlin go, Javonte Williams, to a small 1-year deal with the Cowboys, $3 million, whatever it was, not a great deal. And then they acquired RJ Harvey with a round 2 pick, and they acquired J.K. Dobbins, who was, a meaningful player in their division last year, and is, I think we all expect, going to have a very meaningful role. We really liked multiple backs in this backfield last year, Sean. I'm coming around to Dobbins a lot, as well as the RJ Harvey excitement. I think one of RJ Harvey or J.K. Dobbins is probably going to wind up being a very important player in 2025. My projections don't really reflect that to the degree of confidence I have in that take.
It's a lot of fun to be able to look at the sheet that you have shared with me here, because I get to see the sort of baseline rates for all of these stats for RB1, RB2, RB3, same thing for receivers, tight ends, what have you. One of the things when I look at your RJ Harvey pick, especially when there are 3 other guys that I do think are going to get work, right, is to try and decide if I'm too enthusiastic or if I do think I should push back on some of these numbers that you have here. It's interesting for me that the touchdown rate is basically the same. It's very, very minimally higher for Dobbins. One of the things that I pointed out all season is, before the signing, like 100% J.K. Dobbins, because he was good last year. SIS has him as one of the very best backs against heavy boxes a year ago. RJ Harvey scored 38 rushing touchdowns over the last 2 seasons and seems like a touchdown machine. Obviously, the TD rate is going to have a lot of randomness in it, but it also does imply certain things about goal line opportunities. And then we look at Harvey as well. It's not like he was a massive receiving back in college. The last 3 seasons, 22, 19, 20, but Ben, like way over 10 yards per reception with all of that put together. 61 receptions in college, 720 receiving yards. He is utterly, utterly explosive. You have the target share for both of those guys as the same.
Identical, yeah.
I guess I might have both of those skewed more in favor of Harvey as just a potentially massively explosive back.
Yeah. So I can speak to both of those. I have Harvey's TD rate at 3.4%, Dobbins at 3.6%. I mean, I have McLaughlin's way down at 2.0%, which is kind of low, but probably kind of pushing the team TDs back. And I have Audric estimates at 3.2%. I mean, basically, I'm saying this will be actually an above average rushing TD rate from the running backs, which it was below average last year. But I think that was more because of the backs that were there. Their offensive line is good. Sean Payton offenses have traditionally liked to give the backs the opportunities in close. And I know from watching Javonte Williams last year that they were trying to run the ball in with their running backs, but it just was not happening. He was getting looks and he wasn't scoring. And so then it ended up being a lot of passing TDs for Bo Nix last year. And I think too big of a split toward the pass TD for what I would expect in 2025. So number one, that's why the rushing TD rates are a little bit above average for these backs. The reason I have Dobbins slightly higher than Harvey is really just the fact that it's a rate stat. And so often I'll do this with the secondary backs when I have them at a lower rush share. If I think that player for some reason may get more of their work at the goal line than the other. So it's a small difference, but I have Harvey 8 percentage points higher in rush share. And I'm basically saying he's going to have a more dominant split between the 20s as the number one back. And so that pulls his overall TD rate down a little bit, even if he has some explosive TDs. That Dobbins was a first step quickness guy last year. Didn't maybe have the long speed, but I think could be good in the goal line area, is a veteran, and should have a similar role to Harvey in that area, that their gap in touches would be less in the green zone. Now, you just gave some really compelling stats about how good Harvey is in that area. And maybe Harvey will just be so successful in close early that it's like very obvious to just keep giving him the ball a ton. The target share stuff gets back to this Javonte Williams 70 targets last year, where I do think Dobbins, who caught 20 plus balls all 3 of his final years at Ohio State, played on some pass downs, hasn't really gotten a chance to do that in the NFL because he's been in Greg Roman offenses everywhere, across the Ravens and then years, and then also with the Chargers last year. He does profile as a guy who pass blocks pretty well and can catch a little bit. One of the big knocks on Harvey that people were concerned about is a lack of pass blocking. And so I have them both at a 10% target share, which is a high rate for a running back and especially high for 2 running backs combined to be at 20%. And I have it that way because I have Harvey getting a lot of targets with intent, sort of like in that old, Sean Payton, Darren Sproles role where he's the weapon out of the backfield. But I have Dobbins getting a decent number of targets in the same way that Javonte Williams wound up with 70 last year, which is that he's actually the guy that they play on third downs for the pass blocking element. And then he does get some targets because of that as well. I would feel a lot more confident in Harvey, in allocating 10% of targets to Harvey, who I think they're going to throw to with intent, than allocating 10% to Dobbins to get to that point. But the reason I'm allocating 10% to Dobbins is Javonte Williams got 70 targets in this offense last year, even though he was very inefficient. It's a specific type of usage that I'm not entirely sure Harvey will get. And so I do think that gets back to Dobbins. I mean, if Dobbins is playing on those pass downs and has the potential, not for 70 targets, but has the potential to get a percentage of those 70 targets, that what those 70 targets represent about how Javonte was used last year, and also has the potential to be close to Harvey in rushing TDs. I still have him a full rush TD behind Harvey because you're talking about a rate stat relative to overall volume. 5.5 rushing TDs for Harvey, 4.5 for Dobbins, probably low. I have 1.8 total for the other running backs, but probably low combined, that they only have 10 total rushing TDs. Do have them combined for 5 receiving TDs as well, have high receiving TD rate for them for a running back or for running backs, plural. And as you said, I have them for the exact same number of targets, have them for the same receiving TD rate, 2.5 receiving TDs each. I do think that gets at the Dobbins upside thesis that even if he's in a committee, Peyton's had multiple good fantasy backs in a lot of seasons in the past, and especially as you've identified, if Estime and McLaughlin are not meaningfully a part of the backfield, Dobbins' secondary role to Harvey, even if Harvey is like Alvin Kamara, could be a nice Mark Ingram role that is not being, or, factor, it's a little bit of the Javonte Williams usage last year. However you want to look at this, I think of it as Pierre Thomas and Darren Sproles way back in the day. It was such a fun version of this Saints backfield. I loved having Pierre Thomas those years, even though Darren Sproles was even better in PPR leagues. But Dobbins would be the guy that's doing a little bit of both on the high value touch side, getting some goal line stuff, getting some receptions, probably playing some empty snaps as well, pass blocking, but playing a role that keeps him on the field. RJ Harvey would be still the guy that you want to have more of. That's the explosive, exciting, efficiency, ceiling type of play.
Then my final sort of Denver question for you is going to hit at a player that we are a little bit split on. Then Evan Ingram, 20% target share in 5 of 8 seasons. You have him projected for a career low. Cortland Sutton, 20% target share in 4 of 7 seasons, but coming off of close to a career high. You have him down a little bit, still very comfortable with taking a lot more from Ingram than Sutton here in terms of looking at, Pat Bryant, Marvin Mims, Troy Franklin, all of those guys probably being involved. Ingram seems low to me.
Ingram seems low to you. He does come out as one of the biggest gaps between ADP and my projection. So it looks low for sure. My take on Ingram's probably a little aggressive, but people have talked about this Joker role for him. And I was doing some digging into the Coach Speak Index back Discord back to, before the draft. And I did that for every team as I went through my process. And probably I got a little bit too take locked here, Sean, and I've been looking at it, and I don't have Ingram ranked as low as my projection came out with him. But before they signed Ingram, both Sean Payton and general manager, I think it's George Patton, were both talking about the Joker role in the offseason. Payton was talking about they need to find the Joker this offseason, and that it could be a running back, it could be a tight end, it could be a receiver, it could be anything. Patton said it's really hard to find the daggone Joker or something like that. He had, he threw one of those soft cuss words in, but he said, I know that it exists. I played against Payton's team in the teams in the past when they had one, and those guys are really dynamic players. Peyton also said at one point it would be really hard to find the Joker. They had the 20th overall pick or something, 22nd overall pick. It'd be hard to find the Joker with that pick in the first round. You can't really get that good a talent. All of their quotes to me were suggesting that what they think of as a Joker is basically just a true superstar. Like, okay, we have Michael Thomas and we build our offense around Michael Thomas, because those are the names they've used. That they've compared to Michael Thomas, Jimmy Graham, Alvin Kamara, Darren Sproles. Like, yeah, all these guys, when they played for you, were superstars at their absolute peak of their powers. And you're telling me you can't even get this player with the 20th overall pick. He's got to basically be a top 10 overall pick in the draft to draft him. And I do think, for the record, that Harvey may be the closest thing that we have on this roster. But I'm explaining on this to say that after Ingram was signed, Sean Payton used the Joker term because he was asked by the media if Ingram was the Joker, because they'd been talking about the Joker. The Denver media does a good job here of connecting the dots. You guys have been talking about this. You've said it could be a tight end. It was Jimmy Graham in the past. Is Evan Ingram your Joker? Did you find your Joker? He said he'd, quote, put him in that category, that family. I think he has those skill sets. That's the bullish quote right after they signed Evan Ingram. And people said, and are still saying, I just saw it this week, Evan Ingram is Sean Payton's new Joker. He said it. That's not what happened, Sean. That's not what happened. He didn't say Evan Ingram's my Joker. He was asked about it because they've been talking about it all offseason. And he basically said, if you're asking me, I'll tell you that the guy that we just signed has some of those types of skill sets, and I'm into it. Previously, he's talking about how hard it is to find this guy, and I can't draft him 20 overall. You know as well as I do that all Evan Ingram has going for him is that target share. He's a low A-dot guy who doesn't use his athleticism.
So I guess that's my secondary question, is that he's played on some bad teams. He has been able, and some of this goes back, quite a ways, but he's actually been able to draw a lot of targets at different A-dots throughout his career. And he has had some seasons where the ball in hand stuff was very dynamic. So is it kind of an age collapse thesis where some of the ball in hand stuff last year was not as good, and he's certainly not a spring chicken? Or
No,
is it mostly
it's purely routes.
The context of Denver?
It's the context of Denver. It's purely routes. I want to add one last thing. Peyton later said the search for the Joker isn't over when he was asked about it later than the Ingram comments, later than the signing. I'm sorry.
I'm glad that the Broncos are continuing to search for good players, because a lot of teams don't seem to be, or something. Right? We want to see teams add good people. I guess I'm going to go out there and say I do think that Evan Ingram is a better talent than the way his 2024 season is generally couched, even though there were red flags. And you don't want to completely ignore those. I think I would be if not for those 2024 red flags, I would be all in on Evan Ingram. And it sounds like that's not really that relevant for you. Like, you wouldn't be in on him either way.
Well, so it gets back to the routes thing. It's the same thing that I had concern about with Mims and Franklin, as we talk about. I don't hate the profiles. I do. Sean Payton's, it's interesting that we started here with the projections, and it's probably, again, too much certainty, because we can be completely wrong. And this gets back to like the different types of things we're talking about with projections. Some of the teams, Sean, I don't know. There's not enough of a background on how the coaches are going to work. I don't know, how Ben Johnson's going to do in Chicago with a whole different roster. I'm not going to just port over what he did with Detroit. I don't know how new coaches are going to do, or new offensive coordinators are taking over in some spots, how they may be different than the past guy. Liam Cohen leaves Tampa and they promote somebody from within, and that new offensive coordinator may be similar to Cohen. Both he and Todd Bowles are preaching continuity, but he may have some new quirks that are completely different than Liam Cohen, or he may not be able to do some of the things that Liam Cohen did. I don't know in a lot of cases. The thing about the Broncos is Sean Payton has a really long history, and I'm probably overstating in my projection the certainty of things happening. This, to me, reflects one outcome that is a concerning outcome for Ingram. I don't think it means you have to not draft Ingram, and that's why, like I said, I'm still going to rank him a little bit higher in the tier of the guys that he goes around with ADP. It's still going to be a meaningfully lower ranking. I do think there's a lot of risk with Ingram at his opportunity cost, that he's just nothing. Now, I do see some of the ceiling stuff. Now, the reason I say the risk is that he's just nothing is they've had this X receiver in the past. It was Michael Thomas. It was Jimmy Graham. It was Marcus Colston. Last year was Cortland Sutton, that runs all the routes and gets all the targets, and he had 135 targets. He ran 587 routes last year. Second on the team was Devon Vele with 315. He played 13 games. He missed 4 games. He maybe could have approached 400 if he had played all 17 games, but he was rotational in a lot of those games. He only went over 70% route share one time all season. You also had Little Jordan Humphrey at 290, Troy Franklin at 265, Marvin Mims at 196. You had, Javonte Williams as a running back at 284. The tight ends were split, 219 for Lucas Kroll, 185 for Adam Troutman, 132 for Nate Adkins. I don't expect that much of a split now that you've brought in Evan Ingram, obviously. But I think part of the case of Ingram is he's a wide receiver, and a tight end's body is going to split out. He's going to play as their slot receiver a lot. And I do think that's going to happen. And I do think he's going to run more routes than Devon Vele as the number 2 guy this year, to be perfectly clear. I don't know that Sean Payton's just going to change his stripes and have multiple players as every down guys. That's a real issue for me that dates back to when they had Jimmy Graham and all those guys, and Robert Meacham and Devery Henderson, these guys we talked about when we talk about Payton's history. Lance Moore, I always loved Lance Moore. I haven't actually dug into his old numbers. I'm pretty sure the reason Lance Moore was never as good as I wanted him to be is he didn't run enough routes. Like, he was always really efficient, and I was like, Lance Moore's super good. I just don't think he was on the field enough. Like, that's just the way, because Payton's doing the rotational stuff and has been his whole career. He's got all these different packages and different types of play designs and all of those things. So the way he runs his offenses, I'm probably, like I said, too confident in that because I have too much history to suggest that. And so this projection reflects that, where I made a note that I had, I gave 4 players exactly 10% market share. So I gave Pat Bryant and Troy Franklin the same number as I gave Harvey and Dobbins. And then I had Marvin Mims just behind that at 9.33%. Because Mims, for as efficient and good as he was last year, ran the fewest routes of those 4 receivers in that middle area at 196. And that included manufactured stuff out of the backfield. They're basically the receiving back late in the year. He was lining up next to Nix when his role actually increased. And then he was in like a 45% routes per drop back role, which is not anywhere close to where it needs to be. And I think that stuff may actually be going away from Mims now that they have running backs they really like. And RJ Harvey's going to potentially be the new Joker and all of that stuff. So Mims has to start getting different usage in vertical routes. And Franklin actually had more upside in that regard last year, despite Mims being more efficient and better overall. It just seems like Payton doesn't like Marvin Mims. I don't know what the deal is there, but I do think Mims is going to play a decent amount. I have him right in that range, 9.3%. It was just the little bit of over projected total targets I ended up shaving off a little bit of Mims. But I basically have Pat Bryant in the Devon Vele type role. I have Mims and Franklin in similar roles, rotational roles. I have both the running backs with good target shares, and I think the running back target share overall rises back a little bit, Shawn, because part of the reason it was a little bit artificially suppressed last year is you had a wide receiver and Marvin Mims lining up in the backfield a decent amount. Now, you may get that from Mims again. You may get it from Evan Ingram. You may get it in a lot of interesting usage. I'll note that Evan Ingram at 13.5% targets for me is actually ahead of those other guys in the fray behind Sutton, ahead of Bryant, Franklin, and Mims by 3.5 percentage points, because I have those guys kind of all around 10%. I do think he's going to consolidate more routes than those guys did last year. I think he runs into a routes issue overall in most scenarios of this season, where even if he's good and he's earning targets per route at a really high rate and all those things. You mentioned target share earlier, and I'm projecting a career low target share, and it's entirely because I'm projecting his routes per drop back to be meaningfully lower than they have been at other times, because they'll do some of the 2 tight end stuff. They'll still bring Adam Troutman and Lucas Kroll onto the field, or whoever, the other tight ends end up being. Like I said, they used all 3 of them for different routes packages at times last year. All 3 of them had at least 15 targets. A 4th guy, Greg Dulcich, had 12 in 4 games. I mean, they're using all sorts of different tight ends. They're using a fullback in some packages, which takes away from the 5 skill players in those packages. They're going to use both backs, I think, at times, and have Harvey out there with Dobbins. And I really do think people are not factoring in with how excited they are about Evan Ingram. I mean, he has to be the Joker. He has to be the guy they play every single down, because if he's not, I kind of think people aren't factoring in enough that he's not going to run enough routes to be able to be. Now you really need him to be hitting the high end of the skill stuff that you talked about. You need him to be hitting a high targets per route and showing that ball in hand ability and all that stuff if the routes are meaningfully, suppressed.
One of the reasons why I wanted to start with the Broncos, I do think they're fascinating. We have this combination of what are the coaches' tendencies with will the coach play to the talent? I think that part of the moat for me with Cortland Sutton is those structural issues you talked about, of the structural setup. But I think also that the rookie versions of Vele and Franklin are probably not viable NFL starters. I think that in 2025, what we're really hoping is that Troy Franklin can be a legitimate starter, that Marvin Mims can do the positive things from his role, that Pat Bryant rounds out this group. It'll be interesting to see how it all breaks down. I think that you have a very compelling case for just the path to volume for the secondary guys is going to be tough. And then how well Bo Nix scores is going to depend a lot on just the efficiency there. And we know that Sean Payton has created a lot of efficiency. Ben, I want to ask you about the Jacksonville Jaguars. You have Brian Thomas at a 23% target share.
23.7.
A 24% target share.
Yeah.
You have Puka quite a bit higher with Devontae Adams in there. So I'm kind of interested in this contrast between Brian Thomas and his target competition versus Puka and his target competition. But before we get into that, and that doesn't have to be the focus of it, but Brian Thomas is kind of crazy, right? Where he had a 27% target share last year from week 4 on. He had a 35% target share from week 12, from after the week 12 bye. Part of that late is that Evan Ingram, who again is a target hog, only played in 2 of those games. I mean, Brian Thomas is basically competing against air, which makes a big difference in terms of how many targets you can corral. So my question is, how much of this is Hunter in terms of Brian Thomas? How much of it is other players? And how much of it is the regression that is sort of inherent in projections?
When we were talking about the 1-2 turn a month or so ago, I expressed on one of our shows a little concern about Brian Thomas, maybe because of Hunter. And I think sort of how I said it was, for all we know, long term, if you look back at this 5 years from now, Hunter could be the clear alpha, which was sort of the case with Malik Neighbors at LSU for Brian Thomas. And so I have been thinking about Thomas from that perspective and maybe a little bit concerned. And I remember you saying something like, I have bad news, that he was the guy that we did take in the second round in one of our first 2 main events. Pretty much ever since saying that, I felt that was wrong. This projection is clearly wrong for what I think from Thomas. There's a notes on the projection page there, Shawn. If you look down at the bottom, I highlight some notes, or I bold them that I think are particularly notable. My last 2 notes in the wide receiver tight end section are: every profile I look at makes me want to put more on BTJ and Hunter, meaning all the guys behind them. This is one of those situations where I went through the projections and I dug into Dyami Brown, who I do think, I think you made a case during one of our recent drafts, could get, he had some decent ball in hand stuff with Washington. They've talked about it this offseason with Jacksonville. He could get some manufactured work and stuff. But looked at Parker Washington, looked at who their wide receiver 5 might be. I ended up putting Trenton Irwin in there because he's got like a special teams role, I think. He came over from the Bengals. I don't know. Maybe it's some other young guy. Brent Strange, to me, not a compelling tight end case for, stealing target share. I was comparing him to Cade Otton in my notes, which Cade Otton, for anyone who doesn't really know the profile, is a routes-based play. He was not exciting per route. Last year, he saw a little bit of a spike in his per route stuff because the other receivers got hurt. And so you
have Strange above the average for a tight end 1. How much of that is just that the other tight ends you don't expect any volume for, as opposed to Strange really factoring in with Thomas and Hunter?
I don't expect him to factor in with Thomas and Hunter. I'm projecting him in a range that it says he's going to run a lot of routes like Cade Otton did in Liam Cohen's offense last year, and be like what Dalton Schultz has been in various offenses in his career. Be like the third guy, a routes-based tight end play. He's out in a route on a lot of different options. And I do think that Dyami Brown and Parker Washington, as far as the competition for the wide receiver 3 role, are not going to, probably steal a ton of targets. Dyami Brown, I mentioned, may get some more stuff. That's relative to the backdrop of where his targets per out last year were nothing. He's not a target earner. He runs a lot of safeties off. Maybe some manufactured stuff will factor in. He can be efficient. When I say he's not nothing, he got paid because he can run safeties off and he can make plays vertically. That is a role in a pass offense that matters. But he's not going to
for him. he flashed in the playoffs, which is the most recent thing that happened.
Yeah, which is great. Yeah. I
And
wrote that in
otherwise,
the notes
people
here.
are probably
Yeah.
not looking at him as anything at all.
Yeah, I wrote he had a really nice year last year as a role player, particularly in 3 playoff games, but he's not a target earner, was my little note on him. But anyway, you look at all these profiles, you look at the secondary tight ends, like you said, and so then you end up giving Brenton Strange a 14% target share, which, as you said, is higher than the average for a typical tight end one. Some of that is those averages, factor in injuries and things. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm basically saying he's going to consolidate routes in a tight end role that doesn't have a lot of good secondary receiving weapons necessarily. And then you get back to Brian Thomas and Travis Hunter. I had the comment, every profile I look at makes me want to put more on Brian Thomas and Hunter. The second comment I wrote was that Brian Thomas Jr.'s target ceiling is really pretty massive. Relatedly, there's a ton of potential work for Hunter too. And if one misses, the other would spike in my projection. So the Hunter thing that's really interesting, I was talking to our buddy Connor O'Driscoll earlier today. I'm doing a slow best ball draft with him. And we're talking about Hunter a little bit. He mentioned to me a note that a cornerback got injured in camp. They expect him to be back for week 1. But there was a quote that Travis Hunter is going to it's going to open up some opportunity for some other guys to get some extra reps on the defensive side. That's something I've been talking about with Hunter all offseason, is that one of the cool things about this unique profile we have is that it gives you flexibility within the season in a sport of attrition, that if you need him to play more on defense or on offense, you can go that direction. This cornerback that is going to miss time is expected back for week 1. I don't see it as a massive change to Hunter's in-season outlook necessarily. But if they did get a bunch of cornerback injuries, I think they may lean on Hunter more on defense. And you have to be aware of that when you're thinking about drafting Travis Hunter. The flip side of that, Shawn, is everything I just said about the ancillary wide receiver options here does point in favor of Hunter if BTJ were to miss time. Then suddenly they have to make Hunter a wide receiver more. He's a huge contingent play, in my opinion. And I don't think people are talking about that. They're hyper fixated on the unique risks for Travis Hunter. And so this is not to answer your question about Brian Thomas. As it goes back to Brian Thomas, so I'm very into Thomas, and I'm making a separate case for Hunter. I'm into Hunter as well. I think they both have strong contingent upside over each other, and I'm explaining that little note. But the Brian Thomas Jr. target ceiling is pretty massive note that I had was because it doesn't even take an injury to Hunter. It could take an injury to DBs that forces Hunter to snaps more on the defensive side. The fact that Brian Thomas doesn't play defense is what creates this massive target ceiling. I had talked earlier in the year about maybe Hunter winds up being the better player overall, and maybe he does. And yet Brian Thomas is still very, very good. And there may be situations where this team needs to rely on Hunter's other skills and not on Brian Thomas's. It's a little like how the Niners sometimes rely on George Kittle's blocking. He's insanely good, but like you, in a lot of cases, would rather just have a wide receiver next to a tight end, because a tight end could be relied on to block. It's a different skill they have. The receiver's just playing receiver. Anyway, Brian Thomas is insanely good. I also did this division first, Shawn. So the Jacksonville projection was very early. I do not stand behind the 23.7% target share on Brian Thomas. It doesn't even match my notes. Again, this is not consistent with how Puka Nacua is one of my very last projections. And by that point, I'm a little bit more warmed up on the target shares that I'm willing to be aggressive with for the best players, right? I have a different benchmark. Oh, I've already projected 30% from Malik Neighbors and Garrett Wilson when I was doing the Jets. I can go a little higher with these guys. I think I was overly regressing Brian Thomas because I just didn't have good benchmarks, because it was one of the first projections I did this year. I did the AFC South first. And it doesn't even match my notes is the point that I'm making here. But in particular, the way that I've come around to Thomas's target ceiling is that, I mean, again, is all the scenarios where the concerns about Hunter, where he plays a lot of defense and not as much offense, then Brian Thomas is the only show in town. I mean, you talked about how he was at the late part of last year, and that's why his target share got so strong late. And that's true, but they didn't do enough around him to make it any different this year. And the really compelling thing for both these guys is the Liam Cohen offense we've talked about, that both Mike Evans in like a massive career and Chris Godwin, who has a long career and some good years and some years where he was route limited but was strong per route. Both of those guys last year, Shawn, had career highs in yards per route run in the same season, in the same offense. I know Godwin's year was cut short, not as many routes. The fact that they both had career high yards per route run in long careers is just objectively a positive note about Liam Cohen. It has to be. And if you're able to get the good wide receivers in your offense the ball in good spots. For the record, they both also had career low ADOTs, even though Godwin's always had a low ADOT and stuff, because he was manufacturing high success rate throws underneath to these guys. Brian Thomas is probably going to get all that stuff. I mean, I'm pretty bullish on Thomas and Hunter and Cohen's ability to get them the ball. I think you've pointed to another target share that I did not do a good job of.
So you have Brian Thomas as the wide receiver 9 with that current target share that we both kind of think might not just be a little low, but might end up being quite a bit low. It's interesting when you look at what the numbers then obviously manifest to with the projections. Usually when you and I go through this type of process, we'll do the projections, you'll see the outcomes, and you'll work through all of the other information that you have and the kind of other methods of thinking about it and have the different portions kind of converge or not. Sometimes one insight or the other will push it mostly in that direction. But man, when I look through this and I think about what what you have Brian Thomas projected for with this 23.7% target share, I kind of like Brian Thomas as the wide receiver too, right?
Wow.
I just
I was gonna say he comes out 9 in my projections. When I went through my rankings process, I ranked him 7. I have him behind the big 4 and then Nakua and Nico Collins, but ahead of Amon-Ra and ahead of London. And, previously I had basically said that Thomas would be out of that whole group would be the one that I would maybe be lowest on. And that's why I started by saying I don't stand by that. But you would not just put him ahead of Nico or even Puka. I mean, you're putting him ahead of Neighbors and Lamb and those guys.
In some ways, Neighbors is the one that I have the hardest trouble with, because I think that Neighbors basically has to get hurt or have apocalyptic QB play again to not almost be on par with Chase and have everybody else gapped. The Jefferson one, I think, is actually pretty easy for me. There are structural
I have
issues
Neighbors
there.
ahead of Jefferson. The structural issues and the hamstring cost him several games 2 years ago. They're saying it's minor. When you already have some structural issues and then that happens, and we're talking about a first round where you want to be on every profile. I hated not being super in on Jefferson last year, and you get these people that are like, you don't know ball, you don't know how good Justin Jefferson is. You said it the last time we talked about Jefferson. You think he's the best receiver in the NFL. I do too. I also think A.J. Brown is a top 3 wide receiver in the NFL with Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. I think he's a superstar, but I don't draft him every time either, right? Like it's fantasy football. So anyway.
So within the context of this discussion then, sort of more than the Rams projection, I want to go to the Cowboys, because CeeDee Lamb is the other guy that I think potentially you have trouble moving someone like a Brian Thomas ahead of. And I mean, this Cowboys offense, I think, could end up being fascinating. So the questions that I have here to kind of bundle them together would be, how hard would it be to project an even higher pass rate for Dallas? Again, kind of as the, either the median or the obviously all the scenarios combined, as opposed to like a 75th, 90th percentile. Like I'm talking about just how unlikely would it be that their center is even higher? And then what would the consequences of a higher target share for Jaden Blue be? And then could we get actually a much higher racer for George Pickens? And what would those things mean together? And what are we looking at here for CeeDee Lamb?
As far as the racer for Pickens, I mean, one of the things I really like about him is how efficient he's been, even with the really high ADOT. Depth adjusted racer has looked really good. I tend to regress that stuff some because it's, number one, he's on a new team. Number two, you have these really efficient players, you project them all really efficiently again. I mean, I project them really efficiently. I have George Pickens over 9 yards per target. I have CeeDee Lamb over 9 yards per target. But pretty soon you're giving Dak Prescott an incredibly high yards per attempt. That maybe is something that I should be doing on a higher level than I am. I have him at 7.6 yards per attempt. Last year he was at 6.9, 7.6 the year prior, 7.3, 7.4 the 2 years prior to that. So 7.6 matches his 4-year high. Now in 2019 and 2020, he was over 8.2, 8.4. It's when he had some really dynamic passing weapons. maybe we get back to that version of Dak where my yards per attempt on him is even still too low. But to answer your question on Pickens, it would not be difficult to envision him being even higher in terms of his racer and his efficiency even higher. I'm just being a little bit conservative with a player changing teams and then how it filters back into the quarterback numbers. The issue of pass rate, I'm going to shout out the Coach Speak Index. When I read through the comments in the offseason, I wrote that I kind of think he's a rube. Not a surprise, but a reminder. Sorry, not the Coach Speak Index guy. Brian Schottenheimer, the new head coach.
Second, but I did get that's what you were saying.
Yeah. The new head coach's comments. I mean, he just spent the whole offseason talking about how you got to run the ball and all of these things. I mean, he made some comments about, like you have, you have to do what you have in terms of play to your talent and all that stuff. But he spent a lot of time talking about running the ball. He did talk about tempo, and they played with tempo a lot in recent years. And I am projecting them for a lot of plays. They've been they had the fastest pace in the league last year when he was the coordinator. They've been fourth in play vol. Top 8 for they were fourth in play volume last year. They've been top 8 for 6 straight years. That's something that's been consistent throughout Dak's whole career. It's something he likes to do is play with tempo. And when you hire from within, in this case where Schottenheimer was the OC, I mean, I feel very confident that we're going to see the tempo be there and the play volume be there, which is I am projecting. The pass rate question, the concern I have is that I think Brian Schottenheimer is going to call too many run plays, is essentially what it comes down to. But maybe, so when you said how hard would it be, I certainly see that possibility that the pass rate could go up quite a bit. But he was, calling the plays last year, or at least part of it. I'm not actually certain if he was or McCarthy was, but they had a negative pass rate over expected last year. Now, Dak was hurt for a lot of it. The pass rate didn't end up particularly high. It wasn't particularly high in 2023. Maybe that is something we see this year. I kind of, when you have George Pickens added to the mix and you have CeeDee Lamb, and that's the clear strength of this offense when you do this projection, is those 2 wide receivers. There's no other profile in this offense that looks incredible. You asked about the Jaden Blue target share. I don't have him for.
As we're kind of going through that, the flip side of the pass rate is that you have the Cowboys projected very, very aggressively in within the kind of range of where they've been in terms of total plays. How risky is that for us that some of these concerns you would have about the coach could torpedo their ability to even get that done?
Yeah. So that's why when you were saying, sorry, correct me if I'm wrong on my interpretation, but when you were saying how easy would it be to move the pass rate up, I'm kind of taking it from both directions. I am aggressively projecting their play volume. And I'm a little concerned about, I do have their pass rate projected somewhat aggressively. I have them at a positive PROE relative to their win total expected pass rate. So I have an expected pass rate relative to their win total, because expected pass rate would be, game situations. And then you get to the pass rate over expected. They were a little bit below last year. I actually have them a little bit above what their Vegas win total would imply about an expected pass rate for this year. To push that number higher and to get to a lot more pass attempts, I guess what I was trying to say is I do already have a pretty strong pass attempt projection at this pass rate with a mild PROE, but an aggressive play volume projection. The inverse could be that if they throw a lot, if their pass rate spikes, I would expect probably the play volume to come down, which is basically what you were saying. And so I don't know.
One of the things I'm just kind of thinking through in my head here is that I think that they're not going to be able to run at all, because you can't run with this running back group. Even Jaden Blue has some real weaknesses, like discussed that his yards before contact are terrible, which is not really what you want in that profile. And so then as we look at the running backs here, because this part is, I think, also interesting, especially as we've talked a lot about Jaden Blue on the show, I thought it was interesting that you project him to lead them in rush percentage. I'm assuming in part because you expect him to dominate over the second half, certainly the final third. But his target share of 8%, I thought was a little bit surprising. That's lower than the target share for the RB1, which obviously an RB1 is going to be on the field more than we expect Jaden Blue to be. But I guess as I'm looking at Blue and I'm looking at our thesis for him, that draft pick for the Cowboys, and then when we make the picks ourselves, it's hard for me to think that it works at all unless just right off the bat we expect Jaden Blue to be an 11% plus target share
Yeah,
guy.
I agree with that. And when you say the RB1, you don't mean on this team, you mean the baseline, which I have in the spreadsheet. I have Javonte Williams as the RB1 in the spreadsheet, but at a 4.5% target rate. I have Blue at 8%. A big part of that is those empty sort of pass downs. So as we were talking through the Chargers a moment ago, I do expect Javonte Williams to be out there for pass blocking and running, some routes and getting some targets. As far as the rush attempts, I have Blue at a 30%. I have Javonte Williams 29.8. Again, that's me rounding off the rush attempts, so it adds up to the total volume. So I have Blue 1 attempt higher than Williams for the year. And then I have Miles Sanders at a pretty healthy 21.3%. So I have it as 131, 130, and 93 rushes. The thing I would point to there is that I'm expecting the veterans to combine for 220 rushes and Blue for 131, and I think that's the way that I would point to my analysis there. It's not necessarily that Blue takes over for the second half, but he does have a meaningful role throughout the year. He's averaging less than 10 carries per game in this scenario, fewer than more like 7.5 or 8, I think. And I'm expecting the veterans who aren't very good to keep getting work and keep getting work and keep getting work, but then eventually not keep getting work because they're just not very good, but get a lot early on. But I think so what I wrote in my notes on this one is I have Javonte playing a lot of pass downs, but Blue blowing him away and targets per out run, basically. Empty downs, pass blocking for Javonte, like in Denver. Blue, they get the ball in his hands with intent guy. Now, I think you've identified that to facilitate that particular note, an 8% target share is probably the low end. It's probably more like 10 or 11% in a lot of the outcomes. I actually think you're right. I think that's probably conservative. Probably some of that goes back to the Kevontae Turpin share I have as a wide receiver 3 because he was used out of the backfield some. I have 1.5% of the targets to Hunter Lepke because they used him on some of these passing downs. That's stuff that was in the data from last year that I probably didn't regress out enough. Turpin might still get some of that, but part of my thesis on Blue, and I write this in the notes, is that they drafted him to take over those Turpin and Lemke snaps. That was the point of drafting Jadon Blue. So, take that 1.5% target share I have to Hunter Lepke. I have 7.2% to Turpin. Maybe a couple of those percents shift over to Blue. He was very efficient last year, Turpin. He may get some work, but maybe it comes from, I have a little bit to Miles Sanders and Javonte, or what I have to the secondary tight ends or something. But it's fairly easy, I think, when you look at the other profiles. Because like the guy, I have Turpin as the wide receiver 3 behind Lamb and Pickens. Because Jalen Tolbert a couple of years ago, when he was not running as many routes and he was in a secondary role, only earned, I think it was like 36 targets that season. And then last year he ran 553 routes. He was, given him basically a starting role and also didn't earn much volume. He had significantly more because he ran so many more routes, but despite really no competition, was not able to really earn many routes. So that's part of the Pickens upside thesis for me, is I think there's no real threat to him dominating the wide receiver 2 targets. Yeah, I have the note here. Sorry. Tolbert had 36 targets in 2023. Jonathan Mingo's not a thing. So I have Kevontae Turpin as like a rotational wide receiver 3, having the 3rd highest wide receiver share, but I still probably am projecting Tolbert and Mingo for too much behind that. I have Tolbert at 5.2%, Mingo at 2.5. That's 7.7% to the wide receiver 4+ in an offense that has historically been pretty concentrated and has basically 2 alpha number ones. I mean, one real extreme alpha and one of the biggest alpha wide receiver 2s in the NFL, in my opinion, in Pickens, who doesn't get credit for that because he was in low volume offenses, but at his ADOT earns volume. I mean, this is a guy that weighted targets per route looks strong. Those types of stuff. Air yards volume looks strong, particularly controlling for the offenses that he's been in and the number of routes that he's been able to run. Because when we talk about the pass share being up and all that, that's the big note on Pickens, is he's going to run more routes this year than he has in any of the years so far in his career. Almost certainly he's going to be competing with CeeDee Lamb. That's different. I mean, it's a harder thing to have the per route profile expand, and I don't think it will, but he's going to be efficient. We just talked about the depth adjusted racer being really strong for him. So anyway, I think Lamb and Pickens really concentrate. I don't think it's hard at all to see my Jadon Blue target share be meaningfully. I also wound up a little bit more interested in Jake Ferguson, although I didn't realize how high Jake Ferguson was going. I mentioned him on our draft last night. He goes like right by all the upside tight ends. I thought he was maybe going a little bit later because he didn't score a single touchdown last year. people are on to the idea that he's probably going to be similar to what we're talking about with Brenton Strange and maybe a better version of it, this number 3 target earner on an offense. Although, I don't know. I mean, I said maybe better than the Brenton Strange thing. I don't know that I necessarily would feel, I don't know. Ferguson's probably not worth his price is what I'm getting at. I got more interested in him doing the projection, but I also think he's probably being drafted closer to the aggressive element there. He didn't earn a lot of volume last year either, similar to Tolbert, despite not really running routes against other guys. People have pointed to his target share with Dak being much stronger. And Dak does like throwing the tight ends, always kind of has. I think part of the Ferguson stuff has been that when they trail and they get up tempo and throw late in games, Dak will just pump the tight end. Ferguson's had some explosive games. He had that one playoff game 2 years ago people loved. And that's basically what happened. They were down the whole game against the Packers, and Dak is just hitting the tight end over the middle over and over as the defense starts to sag off a little bit. So Ferguson, I think, can have some explosive like catch games at times. But like when you get into the base stuff, the neutral game script stuff, I don't think he's a big target earner or as talented as people think he is. But anyway, that would be the competition for Blue as I kind of broke down the Turpin and the other depth receivers. I think you're looking at Lamb, Pickens, and I think Blue could pretty easily for me be that 11% target share guy you said, instead of, you know, Ferguson being that meaningful third guy or some other wide receiver or any of the other backs.
Hope that we get some good Blue targets. I mean, obviously being an Austin Eckler, being a Darren Sproles, being a Danny Woodhead is very, very difficult. But I mean, that's Blue's. I've talked about the weaknesses in his rushing profile. I think his receiving profile is excellent. His athleticism is off the charts. And
there was a quote yesterday.
The whole thing about the Cowboys picking him, I mean, you got to be picking him to be a superstar as that, you know, Eckler-ish type back. I mean, that's where it has to come from first, it would seem like to me.
Yeah, there was a quote as well. As you were talking through all the exciting stuff about his analytical profile, there's this comment before camp that, you know, maybe the quote was he was borderline lazy, you know, from a coach that was on the team 20 years ago. Brian Schottenheimer had a quote about his progress the other day and specifically went out of his way to say, what I like is the professionalism he's shown at this camp. So
great.
That's good to hear.
Great. Yeah. Well, I don't know exactly when to throw this in, but Ben, we had a kind of fun little mini conversation around Breece Hall several years ago when we did this. I can't wait any longer. I'm going to go to the New York Giants and say that if Cam Skattebo's target share is the 7.5%, well, first, it's not going to be. But if I'm wrong, and I'm often wrong, I will be heartbroken. One of the things that did pop out to me, you mentioned, I've got the article about the 15 backs you need to draft. We're still a long way from knowing what this Skattebo and Tracy breakdown is going to be. The reports on Tracy is that he looks better. He looks more polished, and that's what you would kind of expect from a guy who was good last year or had some good things about what he did and is very athletic. Cam Skattebo, the notes are that he is awesome as a receiver, which I think, again, because of what he looks like, is a little bit tricky for people to fully conceptualize, and that he's made for the padded practices. Man, if you're made for the padded practices and you're also a receiving star, it just seems like you're off to the races as a running back.
This is such a fun one because it's a great example of how you're not nitpicking. You're seeing something in the projection that you're like, you're not giving Skattebo enough love. And Skattebo's a guy that I was not as into around rookie draft season. You know, you were having to talk me into that a little bit in our dynasty conversations. You were having to talk me into it a little bit in our early main event. Because I'm like, dude, this guy's 40 time was over 4.6. Like, that's that benchmark we don't like. I did this projection, Shawn, and understood your Skattebo love fully. And I got to, he's a very good target, and Tracy's a guy that you don't want to be taking probably, even though Tracy's very good. And even though I projected Tracy, you'll note, for some better stats, I have him for a better yards per carry. I thought you had mentioned to me that Tracy had some bad peripherals last year. I was surprised to see that he had a 4.4 yards per carry last year, despite some of that and some weak O-line play. I think he actually does have some explosiveness to him and some things that are probably a little underrated. He's actually able to
it helps to be fast.
It helps to be fast and have some long runs. Rushing efficiency per carry is very low on the list of importance, right? Relative to goal line work, which we agree Skattebo is built for. Obviously, you just said he's built for padded practices. He's this hyper physical player that they're going to like. And then in particular, when you start looking at the athleticism profile, which and you were telling us before the draft and trying to tell me after the draft, but I didn't internalize it until I did my own work on it. His 10-yard split is way better than his 40-yard time. His broad jump and his vertical jump are elite. He's an explosive player in the ways that a very physical back you would like him to be. He can hit the holes and then break the tackles and get into the second level and actually make some good plays. And then you see that not just in his rushing work and the missed tackles forced and the yards after contact and all the things he has, but he had really good receiving efficiency, as you said. He's a legitimately great receiving back. That's going to play up in the red zone. You get the small area of the field, you don't need to run 40 yards, right? You don't need to, doesn't matter if your top end speed maybe isn't quite to the same degree if you have that type of explosiveness with the jumps and all of those things. And so Skattebo is going to dominate the touchdowns over Tracy, unfortunately for Tracy. As I went through the projection, Tracy has the wide receiver background, but Skattebo, I wrote in my notes, has a better receiving profile to this point, despite Tracy playing the position wide receiver, in college at a point. And so I do think that Skattebo probably dominates on the receiving side as well. And so you get to this perspective where, Tracy's the between the 20s back and Skattebo's the high value touchback. And it's not a very great offense and all that stuff. But the guy you want to attack when their ADPs are similar is the guy that has the potential for all the touchdowns and the better receiving role and all that stuff. So the way I projected it in the end is 7.5% targets to Skattebo, 5.5% to Tracy. You're probably arguing that gap should be wider. I think it's, at least a little bit fair to Tracy being a receiver in a past life and having a decent target share as a rookie. And then I also have 2% to Devin Singletary, just because the one thing he does do pretty well is he pass blocks pretty well. And I don't think he's going to play a ton. My note on him was he had double-digit carries in the first 4 weeks last year and then didn't have more than 8 in the game after that, was quickly an afterthought, will be 28. But he is a good pass blocker, and I think he will play on the third and long situations in particular. They'll have him out there on the obvious pass downs as the veteran, basically like a Samaje Perine type role as a third back, and so you get a couple targets throughout the season there. But all of that adds up, Shawn, to only a 15.5% running back target share, which is low. It's a small bump from last year. Probably what you would argue that I immediately recognized was probably the mistake with the Skattebo target share as you started talking through it, is that my running back target share is too low, that these guys are going to throw to the backs a little bit more. Now, part of that is because both Jackson Dart and Russell Wilson have really high ADOTs relative to Daniel Jones, whose whole career has been a lower ADOT guy. You bring in these dudes that are going to play quarterback, and Jameis Winston as well. They're going to be a lot more vertical. It's why I was very excited about Neighbors and actually did move Wan'Dale Robinson's targets down from last year pretty meaningfully. I keep emphasizing on every single show. He had 140 targets last year, and he's going to like the 16th round because people are so confident he can't be at all efficient. I do think he's going to have below average efficiency because of the low ADOT, and he's not. He's a small dude. He's not going to break a bunch of tackles after the catch or anything, but he's going to see 100 targets this year pretty straightforwardly. But I do think his target share gets hit negatively because you got these quarterbacks that want to push it downfield and then may hold the ball when they don't, instead of getting it down to the running back, may take sacks like Russell Wilson likes to do. And so that impacts, I think, the running back target share a little, but 15.5% is low for a team. And so, when you're also giving some to Devin Singletary there and you're keeping Tyrone Tracy in shouting distance of Skattebo, what I would argue is you've correctly identified a number that, from how I felt about the research behind the projection, 7.5% target share for Skattebo would be my floor, basically. But it's where I wound up. And I can see all these scenarios you're talking about where it's higher, injuries to other places or what have you. He's going to have a role in the passing game. And this is probably about what the floor of that would look like. If Tracy were hurt, for example, I would just basically port over his 5.5% over to Skattebo. Now he's at 13%. He's getting both of them. I really do think he would just consolidate all of that. And so, I don't think the 7.5% target share in any way or I should say, it doesn't reflect in any way what I actually feel about what Cam Skattebo's receiving role could look like. And I do think he's the clear play. I went through this projection. And I was like, this is what Sean's been seeing and been trying to tell me is this dude's going to get all the high value touch stuff that I love. He's going to play on pass downs. He's going to be good on pass downs. He's going to catch the ball and get upfield with that first step explosiveness that showed up in his yards per target and in his collegiate receiving profile. And people talked about Skattebo lined up outside and ran downfield routes. His air yards weren't actually that amazing. It's good that he has that skill set, but his yards per target being above average were not because of that. They were because of the catch and run, which is I take as a positive. I mean, he's just efficient.
He runs so ferociously that people talk about guys like David Montgomery, Zach Moss, and some of these guys fail because that's actually not going to work if you're not athletic enough. One of the things in the article that I just put out talked about how Montgomery and Moss are more limited types of players, probably, than Skattebo. And some of the leaping numbers, again, we don't want to be too precise with everything. Say, oh, a better vertical, this guy's way more explosive. But both the on-field results and some of the tested athleticism suggest that you could be David Montgomery plus and maybe plus. We say all this, and now Tyrone Tracy will be, this year's Chase Brown. I did want to ask you about these, the structure, because as you were saying that, I was thinking about the quarterbacks, thinking about Russell Wilson, thinking about how uncertain we could potentially be with Jaxon Dart, because he's going to probably be asked to do things just completely differently than he was at Ole Miss. The other sort of portion of it that allows Wandale to get, so it allows Malik Neighbors to be way above the wide receiver 1 baseline, Robinson way above the wide receiver 2 baseline, Darius Slayton meaningfully above the wide receiver baseline, is that you're also not very optimistic about the tight ends in this offense. Is this about talent, or is it again about structure where you think these QBs are really going to pass it to the wide receivers?
Theo Johnson had an 11.7% targets per route last year. Not a very productive prospect profile. He did have some intriguing depth-adjusted efficiency, but Daniel Bellinger also has 3 years of that at this really low ADOT, where they've used Bellinger in the secondary kind of catch and run role as well. I just don't really like the volume proposition for the tight ends. I think they're going to be using these kind of catch and run roles underneath the downfield stuff. But I mean, for him to have an 11.7, Theo Johnson to have an 11.7% targets per route last year in an offense where Wandale Robinson in an underneath role had 140 targets. Did I mention that? Had 140 targets.
I love Wandale Robinson. The entire thread that I have with our buddy Peter Overstep for like the last 3 years just says Wandale. That's the subject heading for the conversation we've been having for multiple years now, 80, 90, 150 messages long, whatever. Amazing. And I think that when you're forced to refresh it, we've stayed with Wandale as the subject there. But it is interesting too that like he noted, and this could be one of these little reports that is utterly meaningless, but that he wanted to get back to being like a normal receiver, like he more or less was in college in the 2025 season. And the way that things were developing early on with the scheme, the play calling, he's like just discussing his frustration that they plan to use him within 2 yards of the line of scrimmage again. And I guess I just feel like if they don't really think he can play real wide receiver, do we not expect the target? I mean, you've obviously moved it down. One of the things, again, is the baseline is super high. I think a lot of times people don't, the calibration is off just because they don't know what the baseline is or what the previous results have been. I guess even with all of that, and even with being a Wandale Robinson super fan, I could see him falling out of this offense to a more meaningful extent.
Well, if he does, then that would be pretty notable. I brought him back up there, but I wasn't necessarily trying to make another huge Wandale Robinson case. I was trying to say that why did Theo Johnson only have an 11.7% targets per route in an offense where Wandale had 140 targets? Like that's at a low ADOT. And Theo Johnson open. Yeah, I mean, why? So it was more to your question about the tight ends. Is like I look at the numbers and I'm like, there wasn't competition, and Theo Johnson couldn't earn volume. And now he's with quarterbacks that probably want to be more vertical, push the ball down the field. Maybe that actually works to his favor in some ways because he is athletic. But yeah, I just don't see the tight ends having a meaningful role. I don't think they're talented enough.
Everything about this projection for me just completely reinforces that you have to take Malik Neighbors anytime that you have a chance. And it was sort of funny. There was a report that in camp, Russell Wilson had thrown one of his patented moon balls and they had connected for a 50, 60, 70-yard touchdown. And then the additional little note was like the defender fell down. So like, okay, well, that is maybe less impressive. But yeah, I mean, those guys are very exciting. And again, for Neighbors, I think exciting regardless of who the QB is. So we maybe have talked about Indianapolis a little bit too much, but I did want to run through quickly with you this question about Tyler Warren, because when you look at the projections as opposed to maybe think through it separately, it really, really hits you that the Colts have not thrown to the tight end basically at all. And that when you suddenly then put Tyler Warren in for a meaningful target share, you're talking about Josh Downs and Michael Pittman having to take a haircut as opposed to taking a step forward. Now, the quarterback situation would potentially increase efficiency. It would potentially increase the number of plays per game. You have the Colts projected more in line with their 2022 and 2023 numbers than 2024 in terms of plays per game. How much of that jumped out to you as being an interesting concern or a relevant concern for our Downs and Pittman enthusiasm, given that the prices on those guys are still just very, very cheap?
It certainly was a concern. And it was a concern to work through it and see that Daniel Jones wasn't as efficient as I mean, his numbers are like pretty bad, but we talked through that a little bit. And now Anthony Richardson's looking really good in camp. And the way that I projected this, Shawn, was 80% dropbacks to Daniel Jones, 20% to Richardson, which was my theory was, okay, Jones is going to start, play a decent amount. They will play Richardson at some point, but there's the possibility that that's not till later. There's the possibility that when it happens, Richardson isn't very good. There's a possibility that Richardson gets injured because he's had, some real issues staying healthy. As we sit right now, I would not project it 80-20 as far as playing time split. It seems like Richardson's the lead at this moment to be the week one starter. Although the other reports have been like, this is going to play out throughout all of August. Like Richardson's done well early in camp, but there's nothing decided on. But I think I would project, even if I had Jones ahead, something more like 60-40. And that would push the pass rate down. That's the big thing in my notes is like, I have the pass rate at 59%. That's roughly where it was 2 years ago when, Richardson missed most of that year. Last year, it was at 55%. Richardson played a lot more. In just the Richardson games, I imagine it was even lower than the Flacco games. I mean, I don't just imagine. I think that's like pretty straightforward. If Richardson plays a lot, you're talking about a lot of games that might have a pass rate of like 50% instead of 59%, closer to 60%. Which is more possible with Daniel Jones, even if that's still a low number, even if Daniel Jones is going to have some designed runs and some of those things and be probably leading a run-based offense. So yeah, the pass volume here is a pretty big concern. A guy that we've compared Downs to or has been compared to with is Jayden Reed. And I was talking to you about him a little bit before the show. I'm still trying to really wrap my head around how excited to be about Jayden Reed, whether that's, extremely excited or through the roof excited. Part of the issue with both of those guys is this idea that they don't play in 3 receiver sets. And I mean, this Colts team does have both Alec Pierce and Adonai Mitchell. And when they go to 2 wide receiver sets and they have Warren out there with them, O'Malley Cox or whoever, probably Downs is coming off the field. It's a very similar thing to the concern with Reed. And so I think for Downs, the 2 issues become that is more clear in this offense to me when you add Warren and you have the other receivers and you have Pittman, then I think it's clear for Reed. I don't think Reed's a really strong bet to play in 2 receiver sets, but if it happened, I think it would be massive for him. I don't think it really can happen for Downs. And then the pass volume and the structure, the quarterback stuff, right? Like Jordan Love's not going to be running the ball a ton. He's a drop back passer. They had a really low pass rate last year, but I expect that to regress. And so that could be a really positive influence on Reed's routes. I just don't know how that can happen if Anthony Richardson's playing a meaningful part of the season. I think you really need Daniel Jones out there to at least get the pass rate into a range. I'm getting a little bit more concerned as I went through my rankings. I definitely had Downs ranked favorably, but I had him a tier behind Jaden Reed in terms of getting those guys aggressive. These profiles that I really like. I think both players are incredibly talented. I think Josh Downs especially. And I had a hard time bringing Michael Pittman way up behind Downs because at least with Downs, I think you have this idea that like, he could be really, really dynamic, and probably Pittman's not that good. He's good. He's better than I think a lot of people understand, but probably not as good as Downs, basically. And then to your point about Warren, I mean, I don't know what to do with Warren. I'm waiting for you to tell me what to do with Warren. I have no idea what to do with this dude. I think he's super fun. We've talked through it a lot. His final season was super productive. He had all the carries, all the rush work, the rushing TDs, in addition to the 100-plus receptions. I mean, the ball in hand stuff, it's just like they were trying to get the ball in his hand every single snap. Played some quarterback prior in his background, and the Colts have talked about wanting to use him in a variety of ways and all of these things, and it's all very, very exciting. But then when you sit and you look at the offense and you realize that Josh Downs is really, really good. Michael Pittman's an established starting wide receiver, above average. Like I've always described him as like a good wide receiver too. He probably never was the number one that people wanted him to be when he was going in the third round a couple of years back, but he's a good number two. I mean, he's a good player. He can earn volume. He can be efficient. He's good. He's done it at different depths. He's a good player. You have those two receivers, and I'm telling myself I'm having a hard time seeing the volume for them. It's really tough on a rookie tight end as well to crack through and be like, oh yeah, this is the offense where he's going to have a real ceiling. And yet I'm ranking him pretty aggressively, Shawn. Yeah, I mean it's tricky. This is a tricky pass game. It's a really tough one. And from a projection standpoint, as you said, when you work through it, I mean, it concerns me. It definitely concerns me to work through it.
So we may have to cool a little bit on the Colts. Another team that we've talked about a decent amount, but there are some interesting things that really do pop out in the projections. And I think a team that is controversial, and it certainly would help to get right, is the Seattle Seahawks. The play per game numbers for them are low, not shockingly low, but low. They have been for years in different contexts. I'm wondering about the potential for their defense to help the offense to get more plays, if there would be anything there. But then I kind of wanted to dive in on these running back and wide receiver splits. So the first one is a little bit nitpicky, but I guess my concern as a Kenneth Walker super fan is that he will have to actually show out this year to hold a big split ahead of Charbonnet. Now, I think the target share there where you have him almost double, I really want to see that. And certainly don't, I hope that's not wrong. The rushing share of 52% to 22% seems a little bit gapped if the efficiency numbers are the same. And so my question would kind of be, is it because in a projection like this with how noisy yards per carry can be, and certainly Kenneth Walker coming off of an unimpressive season, we're kind of hoping that the evasion, the big plays change this. But if both of these guys are around 4.2 yards per carry in an offense that we think could boost players who are probably good. I mean, Walker's probably awesome. Charbonnet's probably good. We know they have some issues at quarterback and the offensive line, so maybe that bounces, pushes it back to this area where all they could really be is average. That might even be an optimistic scenario. But do we need a big efficiency gap between Walker and Charbonnet to also get the type of workload split that's reflected here?
Probably. And so I said I'd started with the AFC South. I always went, and I did, but I always bounce around a little bit when I start my projections. And for whatever reason, the Seahawks were a team that I was interested in projecting early. So I'm shocked to see that I only have 4.2 yards per carry on Kenneth Walker. That's wrong. And I think it's very similar to what I was saying with the Brian Thomas target share, where because it was one of the early ones, I was like, oh, I don't want to push this too much. And his career, he was 3.57 last year. His career number's 4.1 basically. But I'm projecting this offense I think we've talked about it. I think this is going to be a much better offense for Kenneth Walker in particular. The reason he was a 3.7 last year was the yards below contact or before contact was so low. It was league worst. I have that in the notes. I'm projecting this to improve the offensive structure to improve his yards before contact and improve the rushing efficiency overall. So it's a situation where normally in a projection, I would deviate from the career numbers more and project a meaningful step forward to what I think the player actually is, what some of the underlying peripherals indicate with like the missed tackles for stuff that was through the roof, as we've talked about, and what I think this offense is actually going to do well. And I just think because it was one of the first 3 or 5 teams that I didn't reflect that enough. A running back like him, I would probably have at least at a 4.5 yards per carry. And so that's going to have a pretty significant difference on his actual yards, because just a half yard when you're running for over 200 carries is could potentially be 100 yards. But yeah, so how reframe that. I was still stuck on something a little bit on the Colts thing that I want to throw in a note that I made all these points about Daniel Jones. I'm sorry to get a little bit sidetracked here. Being better for the pass game, and something I noticed in the projection that is worth emphasizing there for people is some context around that low ADOT that I mentioned. He had a 7.5 ADOT last year, sub 7 the years prior. His career highs were like just over 8. Anthony Richardson was at 12.3 last year. So when I do projections, I usually it's hard to split the quarterback efficiency different because you have the receiving numbers feed into the quarterback numbers, but I had to work at the quarterback efficiency stuff. I have Anthony Richardson projected for this massively higher ADOT, massively lower completion percentage that is associated with the ADOT. So part of Daniel Warren and Josh Downs stuff, if Dan Jones is out there, he throws underneath and completes passes underneath. That's good for those guys. That's the big point, I think, is this ADOT point. But anyway, back to the Walker and Charbonnet question. You said the gap in rushing share that I'm projecting is maybe wider than you would expect. Is that correct?
Yeah, I hope that that's right. I somewhat think that even if Walker plays well, that they're just going to have a lot of work for Charbonnet too.
And maybe that's right. I think Charbonnet is a good play as well, and I have him ranked pretty aggressively when I went through the ranks. The thing that I feel very strongly about is this is going to be a really run-heavy team. I can't remember where I wrote it. I think it's in one of these notes, but I wrote that I feel, or maybe it was in one of my articles, but I wrote that I feel very strongly this is going to be a very run-heavy team based on the the coordinator decision to move on from Ryan Grubb, the comments, the things that were written about Ryan Grubb, and the disconnect with Mike McDonald, and then the idea of bringing in Clint Kubiak and the ways that he structured his offenses. He's a part of the Kubiak Shanahan tree. Alvin Kamara, I believe, was pacing for a career high in overall touches when he got hurt late in the year, and a lot more run heavy than some of his past seasons. Still caught a lot of passes, but just this rushing attack we saw from Clint Kubiak with the Saints last year before the Seahawks bring him over here. I feel more strongly that we're going to see that on a team level, and that's part of why you see the play volume being lower that you mentioned, that I do think, you get a lower pass rate, you keep the clock running, those types of things. Now, the question you had about the defense potentially creating more opportunities for the offense is, I talked earlier in the offseason about not liking the Seahawks on a team level. The way that the Seahawks work is if Mike McDonald's able to really grow this defense in year 2. And I do think throughout year 1, the defense got better because they were starting to get the buy-in. And I think McDonald's a really good coach. And I don't think the Darnold and Cup decisions were good decisions, but I don't think Seattle's going to be necessarily terrible because of the defense and what that could create. And so I could see that point that you just mentioned being something that does play out for the Seahawks. They run a few more plays because they're able to control the ball. My concern is, and I've said this to you in the offseason at other times, that even if they are good and their defense is good, they're going to try to win like 17-13. Like they're going to be the Arthur Smith, like Steelers type, like what we're expecting there is what I think. And maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's the way Clint Kubiak did it. Everyone talks about those first 2 games for the Saints last year, but the big point there was like they didn't throw. There was the one game where they only threw like 14 times or something. They just got ahead of the Cowboys, I think it was in week 2, and ran and just kept running it until they just basically put them away. That's how they want to win games, the ways that teams won games in the 1970s. Anyway, even if they get more opportunities, I think a lot of it goes back to the run and then potentially runs the clock and then potentially just keeps the whole team level play volume down. So Pat Thorman in his awesome pace article wrote that Seattle's D had faced the 6th most plays heading into their bye last year. And they had run the 9th most offensive plays. They dropped the 9th most offensive play from the 9th most offensive plays to 31st after the bye. That was after the McDonald Grubb sort of falling out. That McDonald basically was like, "You're going to run this offense so slow that it allows my defense to face fewer plays." Was sort of the point. And they restructured that kind of in season and then particularly the off season. So I feel very strongly about that. What I feel less strongly about is the workload split. That's what I was saying. I can't remember where I wrote this. I feel less strongly that Walker's definitely going to be the guy, but they do talk about him like he's so dynamic, and the missed tackles for stuff and the explosiveness. Charbonnet was really good last year and is probably a good runner, but I think they see Walker as a playmaker that you have to get the ball in his hands with intent. That's the thing I feel less confident that but it was something I did push a little bit in this projection, which gets back to why the 4.2 yards per carry doesn't make any sense, because it was what you asked the question. Doesn't he have to gap him in efficiency to gap him this much in usage? And that's exactly right. That's what I was trying to project, but I didn't do a good job with the efficiency side. That Walker is going to be the meaningfully better back in terms of when both are healthy and you're in a neutral situation or in a close game. He's the guy that they're going to want to prioritize. They're not going to not use Charbonnet, but they're going to want to prioritize Walker as their lead. That's the way I projected it. I'm not super confident necessarily in that take. I do think it's going to be a very run-based offense, and I think Walker and Charbonnet are both good players to attack.
Yeah, that's the way I've been looking at it as well. Before we leave the Seahawks, walk me through a little bit the Jackson Smith-Njigba projection. He has only a slightly above the wide receiver 1 baseline target share, despite it doesn't even seem to matter that much about Cooper Kupp, because the wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4, I would argue is more or less non-existent. Now, you have an aggressive running back share between Walker and Charbonnet, and that probably makes sense. It's also one where even though Elijah Arroyo is below the average for a tight end 1, because AJ Barner is well above the average for a tight end 2, you do end up with some decent tight end targets, which probably if you're a JSN fan, you're hoping they aren't able to throw to the tight ends quite that much. We also have this interesting element where you have the A-dot morphing to a little bit more of an intermediate deep player. You have the racer coming quite a bit down. Is the racer component there a function of the changing A-dot? Is it a function of regressing that to a more reliable number? Can JSN fans hope that he gets both more target share and is more efficient than these numbers suggest? Oh, I guess I should mention, as part of that, just, concerns about Sam Darnold.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. The A-dot rose quite a bit from year 1 to year 2. He was much better after Metcalf's injury 2.35 yards per out run across the final 11 games, starting in week 7 when Metcalf was first hurt. And I think I looked at, as far as the specific notes on his ADOT, I looked at Chris Olave a little bit in the Clint Kubiak offense last year, whose ADOT actually came down from a much more vertical ADOT the first couple of years. But I do think this offense being so run and then play action based, it runs a lot of those like over routes that are, deeper intermediate routes. I was essentially, so JSN got to a 9.2 ADOT. I'm projecting him up at a 10.5. That's still below the league average for a wide receiver by a little bit, but I'm essentially projecting him for more air yards overall. Is sort of the point, that he's going to get a few more deep intermediate looks, as the target share is maybe also not great. And part of the reason the target share was not great is they run a lot of 2 tight end sets. They do throw to the tight ends a decent amount. One thing I did do is when I removed Noah Fant from this projection because he got released, I moved the overall target tight end target share down, and I put that back on JSN. And I talked about this in a piece around when I released my projections, when I talked about some of the different little changes that I had made after finishing some of these projections. I had to go back to the Noah Fant one because I had done this projection early and then had not released the full projections yet, and I didn't want to have Noah Fant in there on release when he wasn't on the team anymore. When I went back to it, it didn't make me just go crazy for Elijah Arroyo. I had a pretty decent, I have a 10% target share on Elijah Arroyo. I have 7% on AJ Barner, but I brought that total tight end number down. That the fact that they would move on from Fant, who's a receiving tight end in some ways, told me that the depth that they previously had at tight end with the Arroyo draft pick made me think that they would maybe use the tight ends a decent amount, which Clint Kubiak did last year, not just including, Taysom Hill, who's a unique case, but Juwan Johnson and Foster Moreau both had some decent targets in this offense. Now, the receivers were all hurt there. But anyway, moved some tight end target share overall back to JSN, really, as the number one player. Now it's okay. This offense, the way it's going to structure is going to be a little bit more. We are going to throw to the wide receivers when we do throw. I'm probably still too low on JSN, but I got more excited about him through that sort of element of the process. But the question about the racer is related to the ADOT bump. The depth adjusted racer stat I talk about, he was plus 0.15 last year. I'm projecting him here at plus 0.10. He was plus 0.03 as a rookie with a really low ADOT, but also low yards per target. Basically neutral. My little formula for the depth adjusted thing, being neutral is actually like kind of bad. I don't have it calibrated perfectly. So plus 0.03 is basically like, probably should actually be like a minus 0.03 or something. At any rate, that's why I don't usually share the exact numbers. Like I know where the ranges are. JSN was really good last year at plus 0.15 in that number. And I'm projecting him at plus 0.10, which is still above average. Certainly when you get to the, plus 0.1 range, you're definitely not needing to calibrate back that far. Anything over plus 0.1, I consider to be really good. Anything over like plus 0.2, you'd be great. So plus 0.115 last year, strong, very strong. But I'm bringing it back because of the Sam Darnold element that you talked about, and then also the ADOT. So his racer still, what I'm saying is relative to his ADOT is still solid. He winds up at an 8.3 yards per target, which is maybe a little low, but that's in part because of the Darnold stuff. I have Kupp at 7.5, meaningfully lower. I have nobody else higher than JSN in the offense because I have Sam Darnold's yards per attempt at 7.3, which is not like super high or really even super low, frankly. In his early years when he was bad, he was never over 7. Last year he was at 7.8 in a good offense. And he was better in within the context of that offense. So I have him at 7.3, coming down a half yard. If I had JSN projected for, those things are going to work together. Does JSN bring up Sam Darnold's passing efficiency? Does Sam Darnold bring JSN's receiving efficiency down? I kind of split the difference, but it brings JSN back a little because I think his quarterback play does get worse from Geno to Darnold. His average target is going to be less catchable and less easy to turn into receiving efficiency. So that's a part of it. I like where I have the ADOT in the context of the offense and the racer and those elements, I think you're right that the target share is probably a little bit low still at 24.7%.
So you were working through that. I was hoping in my mind that perhaps the changes to the offense and hopefully at least mild upgrades on the offensive line will maybe cancel out the difference in QB play. I do think that Geno Smith is a far better quarterback than Sam Darnold. What he was asked to do last year was so difficult that maybe that really is a big change in terms of the difficulty of what Sam Darnold is being asked to do this season. And so we could get better play simply as a result, especially when we're talking about it within the context of a run heavy offense where even if you have a good target share, you're not looking at elite play volume. This projection for JSN puts him at wide receiver 19. He's sitting at wide receiver 15 in ADP, but it's also the case that you have plenty of guys who are being drafted a round later, or in some cases, many rounds later, in a virtual dead heat with him. And so does it follow from that? I know that you have not been that excited about him when we're doing the drafts. Is it just very clear cut at this point that unless we find our way to a very different thesis, the JSN has maybe even more sort of downside than upside, even from the wide receiver 19 position in terms of how that functions? Or do you think that giving him the target share boost makes it a little bit more palatable?
Well, it could make it a little more palatable. I guess I want to turn that around to you because that was a range of wide receiver when I did my rankings, which I'm going to release soon, that I didn't feel comfortable with. I had Adams ahead of these guys. I put Xavier Worthy ahead of JSN, but then I did put JSN ahead of Marvin Harrison and then ahead of Garrett Wilson. And I have all those guys ahead of T. Higgins because I think T. Higgins is crazy overpriced. I have Tetroya McMillan right behind them. And so, yeah, you're bringing up Xavier Worthy and McMillan, guys that go a full round later, like you said, that I like in this range, frankly, like to be similar in terms of how many targets they see and how much of a focal point of their offense they are. McMillan, my projection is actually quite a bit lower overall, the efficiency side especially, but I see more ceiling, I guess, there in terms of outdoing this projection for a rookie right away than what I'm seeing in the JSN projection based on how confident I am in the Seahawks offense, which could be wrong. And so I did still rank JSN higher than where this projection comes in. The other players that come around him that are multiple rounds lower include guys like, Jerry Jeudy that we really like. I still have him ranked a little bit lower, in part because he goes a lot lower and there's a lot of uncertainty in his offense as well. I guess I have McLaurin behind these guys, and he goes somewhat in this area. And I've talked and tweeted it the other day for people who saw that, created some little bit of buzz, I guess, on Twitter that I was just saying that he's never really been a super high target earner. And my concern going through the projection on him was the touchdowns really spiked last year. He didn't really see a massive increase in targets per out. And people are talking about, well, he's Jayden Daniels number one. And I'm like, yeah, he was last year. Like, why are we double counting that? Jayden Daniels was really good last year. He got that bump last year. He's 30 in September. He's holding out right now. Why are we not talking about any of the potential negatives around Terry McLaurin? We're just talking about the thing that already improved his numbers last year. He was second in the NFL in receiving TDs. He was something like wide receiver 16 in PPR points per game. And I had a bunch of people tell me, well, no, in full season PPR points, he was wider, in half PPR, he was wide receiver 6 overall or something. I'm like, yeah, that's the reason I was talking about it that way is he stayed healthy for 17 games. And I think it's more of a concern in PPR. The touchdown stuff plays up better in half PPR, sure. I do think he'll score TDs at a reasonably high rate, but what's he going to do? Score 20 touchdowns? Like, how many more touchdowns do you think he can score when he's not even earning that many targets, that much volume? So anyway, Terry McLaurin comes into this conversation as well. The point I'm trying to make as I talk through these different players, Shawn, is I don't like that range of receivers. We've talked about it. I also don't necessarily want to draft a lot of other guys ahead of them. I guess what it comes to, the takeaway for me, and this is why I have Devontae Adams higher, is the guys that have the real ceilings at receiver. They they're really worth chasing. And I think Adams has that potential, especially if Nacua were to miss some time or something. Although, man, the Stafford back injury stuff is concerning. But that's why Tyreek Hill shot way up, and I have him, higher up, as he has that real ceiling. All the dudes above that first, what I like to call big tier break that we were talking about earlier with Brian Thomas, and it's why you can't push Amon-Ra St. Brown very far down. I mean, anybody who has the potential to be a massive ceiling guy, which is what Xavier Worthy does. It's what, you and I were talking about Worthy and Rice a little bit before the show. You had that awesome piece about him, but I think Rashee Rice has that once he returns, that potential to be in PPR, just a really high volume and therefore high point per game play. I think McMillan has that as a rookie. So a lot of these guys that I'm excited about them as players. I think in their ceiling cases, they can be very good. They can be like Terry McLaurin was last year, a bottom end, top 10 wide receiver in total points if they play all 17 games, because obviously then they move ahead of the guys that missed 1 or 2 games. But in terms of how impactful that is in this draft range, if their points per game is more like wide receiver 15, which I guess is what I think the Jackson, Smith-Njigba upside cases probably are. But then the question is, who do you draft in those ranges? I mean, I mentioned this to you. Once I rank, I really like Kenneth Walker. Once I rank him aggressively and rank Xavier Worthy aggressively and some of these players that I do think are underpriced, I still wind up with JSN or Garrett Wilson in the late third, where I've said that they're undraftable, basically. So there's a few guys that I think are underpriced that I do want to take in those spots, but I don't want to be drafting the same players in those spots every single time. That was a little bit of the mistake. It was why I missed on Cooper Kupp's breakout year, and I had him in a couple leagues, but I really liked DJ Moore at that 3-4 turn in 2021 and a couple profiles at that 3-4 turn. And it's why I didn't have a lot of Cooper Kupp, despite a lot of people crediting me with my analysis, talking them into Cooper Kupp for that year, because I had talked through the targets per out run profile and how the routes could increase and all of the type. He was the clear pick for the Rams over Robert Woods. That was the first year me and Leone did the projections pod, and Leone brings that back up every year, that we talked about Cooper Kupp being the way to play the Rams passing game, as we talked through that projection that year. But I didn't get a lot of him because I was so fixated on other players at that range. And I feel like I'm doing that this year. And I'm trying really hard to be diligent to understand if Jackson Smith-Njigba, for example, is a player that I do want exposure to. I have a hard time seeing it based on all of the moves that they made and what their offense is going to be structured as. I feel pretty confident there's not going to be a lot of pass volume in this offense. Maybe I'm wrong on Darnold. Maybe Darnold can be better. And maybe that does elevate the pass rate a little bit. I still think it's tricky, but JSN, the long point there, Shawn, is I still have him ranked wide receiver 15, higher than the wide receiver 19 in the projection, despite talking about how I don't know that he has a real ceiling, because I guess I can kind of see it. I can see it more than I can see the Marvin Harrison stuff, but I mean, I could see it for Marvin Harrison too. If I really squint, they force feed him a bunch. Of Garrett Wilson right behind that, I'm really squinting still, but the target share could just be 35%, even though I don't like the way that offense structures. But the point is, like, if there were more profiles like Tyreek Hill's, where I think that, this player could have a ton of volume in an offense that also should throw a ton, or Devontae Adams factors that way, even though these guys are older. I mean, I would move them ahead of most of these players. It's just a tricky range. Another of the players that I have ranked there is Zay Flowers. I think he's incredibly talented. I think he's basically capped it where I have him on the projection, a lot like these other guys. It's like these offenses.
Well, I was going to tell you that I thought you maybe even had Zay a little hot. Now, the thing is that he does come in decently projection-wise related to price. And so if you do like that projection for him, then I think it makes him a pretty good pick. One of the things I want to mention is, you have the negative Terry McLaurin rhetoric coming at us there, which I'm predisposed to believe to buy into. And yet his projection is well above JSN. And, so when I hear you say that, but also know that you would have reflected that in your projection, that does balance that for me a little bit. Kevin had a note, or just like a theme.
Just to comment on that, I have him 18 points higher, 4 wide receiver spots higher. You said well above, and that's mostly all. Yeah, it is. It is in a projection, but it's mostly all.
In a projection is a lot in this range.
It is, It's all because of touchdowns. If you look at it, I actually have JSN for more targets, more catches, slightly fewer yards. I have Terry McLaurin at 8.9 TDs and JSN at 6.2. So a 2.7 TD gap. How far are you going to regress McLaurin's TDs? How many TDs are the Seahawks offense going to score? And how many is Darnold going to throw for? I think it's going to be a lot of run based. They've talked about wanting to run in the red zone. So maybe that's a point in McLaurin's favor over JSN. I mean, you may be right, but I just wanted to note for the listeners, I don't think you're wrong to say that's a gap. You're right. That is a big gap in projections. I do have JSN projected for more targets and more catches, so it's there's some context there. Anyway, where are we going with
does
that?
matter. I mean, the crazy one too, when you think about like the polar opposite ends, the projections for McLaurin and Debo, when you think about it from the perspective of their targets are maybe not going to be that different, but everything else about what they do is going to be two far sides. That part I think is fascinating when you look through it. Kevin had I think a good frame for his big Washington piece on the site that actually did throw me a little bit in that, we've said that we think Jaden Daniels could be the QB1. He's got this monster, almost untapped ceiling. If somebody goes out and has like a 32 point per game season at QB, which I mean, you're basically talking about the greatest Lamar Jackson seasons and the greatest seasons of all time in terms of the scoring format that I'm thinking of. Obviously, QB scoring formats move around a lot, but around 30. So, like, if I say 32, I'm talking about Jaden Daniels just like blowing everything that's ever happened out of the water, basically. So, Kevin's concern here is that, I mean, these guys are all propped up by Jaden Daniels. You mentioned the career highs that Terry McLaurin has had. We think about what Zach Ertz did in some moments last season. We think about where Deebo Samuel potentially projects if he can play okay. But the question for the Commanders isn't just, how much can Jaden Daniels do or if there's some risk for an individual player. But when you're talking about Austin Eckler, when you're talking about Ertz, when you're talking about Deebo, and then we're talking about McLaurin not being a target hog and coming off of a career season, you have multiple points of potential collapse with the Commanders. And if that happens simultaneously, then it makes you kind of interesting for guys like then I currently consider the running back there, Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, to be the biggest hype guy of this entire offseason. It'll be interesting to see what happens. But then Jalen Lane. So it's not that there is no one behind these players, but certainly if the Commanders have to sort of change horses in midstream a little bit because they have multiple guys collapsing, I mean, that kind of bums me out for Jaden Daniels.
It does, but Jaden Daniels elevated. I mean, he weekend at Bernie Zach Ertz. Like, I mean, he's
all right, but we've seen that same thing from Patrick Mahomes with Travis Kelce, and it did finally start to come to an end last year.
Okay, but
and maybe people would say that he didn't do that, but I think that it's fair to maybe have that perspective on Kelce. And it does still finally come to an end.
I think the way that Jaden Daniels elevated the players around him is more meaningful than the way that Patrick Mahomes probably did in that analogy, in which I know is blasphemy, but particularly as it relates to the Cliff Kingsbury offense, where they do all the read options and the RPOs, and his mobility is so positive for the runners, but also he's so good at diagnosing pre-snap when he can pull and throw to the edge. And they're basically just saying, where are you going to put the numbers along the line of scrimmage? We're going to go, the ball's going to go where you're not. And we have these different option elements based into it. And it's going to be an extended handoff to the edge. And he's going to do it as well as Tua does it, who's probably the best in the league at getting the ball out to the edge accurately and on time so the player can actually catch and run and the blocks can get set up and all that stuff. He did that incredibly well all the way into the playoffs. Terry McLaurin had a long touchdown in the playoffs against the Lions. But McLaurin, part of the issue for him is the number one target shares. He didn't get that usage as much as Olamide Zaccheaus did. And that's why they brought in Deebo Samuel. That's why they drafted Jalen Lane, who has rushing production, kick return production, and punt return production on not just one, but two different college teams, because he played for Middle Tennessee State. Then he went to Virginia Tech. It's that old John Moore stat that Tyler Lockett had and Antonio Brown had and T.Y. Hilton had, that if you have the production and all these different all these different phases of the game. Lane had it, and he had it at multiple different colleges that decided we want the ball in his hand in every single phase, and that's who they went out and drafted in the 4th round. He's going to be in that mix for ball in hand stuff. I think what Daniels did so well last year and does not get credit for, and it's so funny when you see there's been a big discussion in the social space about some of the like top 10 quarterback lists, and some people left Daniels off their top 10 lists, and they said so because, or at least my understanding of why they would do that is he was playing in a very option-based offense and not doing a lot of the drop-back traditional stuff. And I think that massively understates how good he was at diagnosing an option-based offense pre-snap and in the flow of the snaps, and then delivering the ball so that his player. So then you can say, well, he has.
You could watch multiple games from Jaden Daniels where he threw. You could watch like 2 consecutive games and not see him throw anything other than a perfectly accurate laser. And I say laser, but when the touch was necessary, it's there. When the accuracy is off the charts.
I mean, we talked about it going into the postseason and through the postseason. He was the best quarterback in the NFC by the end of the year. I mean, maybe Jalen Hurts goes and wins the Super Bowl, and he doesn't get enough credit either. Maybe you reference him. Maybe there's some, a couple other quarterbacks that you want to hold up a little bit. And I'm not trying to diss anyone else is the point. But Jaden Daniels played the position at such an incredibly high level and is a really good fit for what Cliff Kingsbury wants to do. And then, as you said, the pace stuff is the other thing Kingsbury always wanted to do, and they really brought that on late in the year. So this offense is going to have a lot of volume in it. I think that's a really interesting note from Kevin. I want to throw at you a different take, an adjacent take, because I don't want to play Terry McLaurin. I don't want to play Brian Robinson. I do want to play maybe a little bit of like really cheap Zach Ertz or whatever. Probably not a lot. Jalen Lane and Ja'Cory Cross-Merritt. And the take essentially is you can't draft any of the skill players on any of the big 4 elite quarterback because of how much of dual threats they are and how much the rushing takes away from skill position production. For Daniels and Lamar, it's the rushing yardage. They both had over 800. For Hurts and Allen, it's the rushing TDs. I mean, the Hurts stuff is crazy. It pulls in Saquon Barkley, which is, silly, obviously. It pulls in A.J. Brown, who we love, and Devonta Smith and all these guys. And that is a concentrated offense. But if you want to capture A.J. Brown's ceiling, you just draft Jalen Hurts. I mean, there's a clear disconnect between where Jalen Hurts is, by a lot of people, not viewed, and we've had this conversation, whether he's a part of that group with the other 3, because of the lack of overall passing ceiling that he's shown and where A.J. Brown is priced. I mean, if A.J. Brown deserves to be in the 2nd round and Devonta Smith deserves to be where he's at, Jalen Hurts is clearly a part of the top tier of quarterbacks because he's now going to have to throw for a career high. And the things that have held down those numbers, and he's never thrown for 4,000 yards or 25 TDs, that stuff's got to rebound. That's what people are playing. So maybe the Eagles thing, I don't know, but I mean, the Bills, they're so spread and they want to be mobile and all these things. You just mentioned it with Zay Flowers, who the team has talked nothing but positively about, but they've had this quote, there's only one ball. Every time they talk about Zay Flowers, we want to give him the ball more. We want to give him the ball more. We want to give him the ball more. He's incredible. He has all these great efficiency metrics, but there's only one ball. And the problem is Lamar Jackson keeps the one ball a lot of the time, way too much of the time for the skill position player's fantasy value. When you look at the Bills, they're constantly talking about everyone eats is their line. Everyone eats, everyone eats, everyone eats. We let everyone have their own role. Everyone eats. I don't know how. I mean, people are telling me Dalton Kincaid.
One of the reasons I really don't understand, even though I like him, Khalil Shakir seems like a very tough pick. And he seems like a very tough pick almost regardless of format. One of the questions I had that we probably don't have time to get into in deep detail, but just this idea of, where do Josh Palmer's targets come from? Could they come from the tight ends more than you have referenced in your projections? But kind of as you go through that, I mean, I do like taking those guys, and that's the difficult element we've worked through. But if we don't like that range for position players, you can take those QBs and you can take them by themselves, and you can hope that they're very efficient and then also score rushing touchdowns, and that's what you need. It's one of the reasons I pushed a little bit for Rashad Bateman, who I do think that you have under projected in terms of really even efficiency, but maybe the efficiency is mostly just a function of you got to regress some of this stuff a little bit to have globally accurate projections.
Yeah, Lamar Jackson's efficiency as a passer last year was so absurd. It was really hard to do the Baltimore thing because I mean, you had to project Lamar Jackson to throw and then I'm also regressing Derrick Henry's rushing TD rate, right? And all these things. And it's like, how many touchdowns am I projecting for the Ravens here? Like every guy on this passing game was so efficient and deserves so much more work because of how good they were last year. Even like Justice Hill, as far as a running back receiving profile looks great. Andrews, Likely, Flowers, Bateman, even like the small sample guys, like, Tylan Wallace did some intriguing things where you'd be like, I mean, he should probably play more in a normal offense. He should get an opportunity to. He's not going to. How was
Tylan was
he
one of
going to
those
play
guys
over?
we love coming out. Never really has amounted to anything. So I think it comes down to you have to play those guys with the really cheap options, even though their headliners are so exciting. And so it's tough, and it's especially tough on individual weeks because there will be individual weeks where the headliners score big. And then there's this feeling of like, why do I keep resisting this when I know that I'm going to be watching these games where Derrick Henry scores 3 touchdowns and rushes for 200 yards and he's not on my teams? But you
That's
still look at the
exactly
full
right.
season numbers and it doesn't quite justify it. And you are playing for a full season. And when you're playing redraft, I mean, that's tough. But that's one of the reasons why I like Keaton Mitchell, because if you do get a Derrick Henry injury, which I mean, hopefully we do not get, we don't want anybody to get hurt. But Keaton Mitchell at the price, then you don't have to worry about it. It's going to be fine. Him as a starter would crush. As it comes back to our Commanders conversation, the thing for me, and probably this is just wishful thinking, so I do want to put that note in there. But I think that we're going to get guys. We're going to have Ben Sinnott drafted very late. We're going to have JCM drafted late, although he may go up a little bit if they just keep talking about him every day. And we're not going to have Jalen Lane picked. But the 2 guys who are picked are going to be cut after week 2. And then all 3 of those guys are going to be added after week 6. And by that point in the evolution of the Commanders, maybe those guys can pay off of the price that you have to pay to get them in free agency.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. I mean, I think, again, this take that I gave you of I guess a part of that take, well, okay, so I go back to the Jets and not being as in on Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall. And one of the things Aaron Glenn said early in the offseason, right after they got Justin Fields, he was at the league meetings in I think on like March 1st or something. On like April 1st, and the last days of March, the first days of April, and they'd already signed Fields. And he was getting asked about it, and he said, he brings the dimension to this game that a lot of people are trying to create around this league that we could take advantage of. And this is a defensive minded head coach, right? The defensive coordinator of the Lions last year, who is watching film all the time, analyzing the league's offenses, referencing why they added Justin Fields, or one of the things they see in Justin Fields, referencing that mobility, which is a thing that a lot of the teams around the league are trying to create. And a lot of the quarterback prospects, we're seeing fewer just stick figure, quarterbacks that can't move around, even coming up from pre-college, I think, but going to the big colleges and then becoming the top prospects, you got to have a little bit of mobility. Not every single prospect, obviously, and the ones that have hit from later rounds have often been a little bit more mobile, and teams know that it positively influences their run game, and they know that that mobility and that game breaking ability is going to potentially extend plays and do things in the pass game. Obviously, this point that he says about his own quarterback in Justin Fields, that there's a lot of people are trying to create that around this league, that they could take advantage of that mobility, that dual threat nature. It gets at that point that these mobile dual threat quarterbacks are still in the numbers that they are running NFL offenses are still a young thing in fantasy history. This is something that, 10 years ago wasn't really a thing. Like maybe like young Russell Wilson was starting to become a thing. We had the Robert Griffin season in like 2013 or whatever, but you still had Brady, you still had Peyton Manning in 2013. You still had, Brady in the later years, and Breeze and Phillip Rivers and all these dudes. And we've talked about how those dual threat quarterbacks score for fantasy and how they change the calculus. I don't think we've done enough research or enough discussion into how they change the range of outcomes for their offensive skill players. Because as I was talking through the different players, I do think in an offense like the Eagles, you could say that it's concentrated enough that, like, obviously Saquon Barkley just did it last year, and Derrick Henry did with the Ravens as well. These guys had really good years. But when you talk about the different ranges of things, you look at the Bills, and the Bills scored the most touchdowns in the NFL last year, and Josh Allen and James Cook were the only ones who scored more than 6 in the entire offense. And they scored a ton, over 60 touchdowns. And so maybe, the lead running back in a couple of these offense scoring all these touchdowns is obviously very notable. Saquon and Henry and James Cook. And maybe it's a statement on chasing the running backs in these situations. I'm not entirely sure, but the range of outcomes of what it can mean for the different skill guys, you get into that Bill situation where it's more spread and you have the dual threat quarterback element, and you just can't play the passers or the receiving weapons at all. You get into an offense where it's more concentrated and you have the dual threat element, and you still have the issue. I would say that's the Eagles. You still have the issue where they get a little too run heavy in the particular season. And AJ Brown has a 2.99 yards per route run, and Devontae Smith has his first year over 2.0 yards per route run, and they're great on a per route run basis. And Dallas Goedert has his second season over 2 yards per route run. They're all great on a per route basis, and none of them is very great for fantasy, because that's another element of the range of outcomes. And then you can get into, other parts of the range of outcomes where you're saying there is some upside and there are some positive scenarios. You can mention on Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin, that Terry McLaurin catches all these touchdowns and things concentrate. And maybe for Daniels and Washington, there is a little bit more favorable play volume elements and things. But the point is, he's still going to eat up a ton of the rushing volume. And if the backfield is split like it is there, you couldn't play Brian Robinson or Austin Eckler last year. I mean, people act like those guys were better than they were, frankly. You really need to consolidate the rushing work for a running back that when the quarterback is also taking so much rushing value out of, it is a huge part of your overall rushing attack. He's running for a lot of yards. He's getting a lot of carries in the design game and all that. In some of those other offenses, he's taking touchdowns away. Now, obviously, Henry and Barkley and James Cook succeeded because they were able to consolidate their backfields. But if you have a little bit of a split, if you mentioned JCM, I'm really excited about him, but man, I mean, that's the issue with Breece Hall this year, I guess was the point. I was going to say he makes it even more of a split in Washington. The issue with Breece Hall is, well, what if Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis play more than we want them to? They're talking about it like they're going to. It just is so tough because Justin Fields is going to have a design run rate that's meaningful, that's going to take away from the offense. The ball's not going to leave his hand on a lot of these plays. It doesn't mean that they can't be good. It just means that their range of outcomes for scoring for fantasy is meaningfully worse than what they actually are as far as skill and their talent is. And that gets back to, you don't really want to pay for the real expensive options where we really need elite ceilings in fantasy. And those elite ceilings, we were talking about Puka Nacua earlier. The reason I'm so high on Puka Nacua is go look at LA's past target shares of their main couple guys over the last several years. It's not just Nacua, it's Cooper Kupp, the Sean McVay offense, and then Matthew Stafford's not taking anything out of this offense. He's your classic drop back. I can gunsling it around, and I'm going to throw it to my number one receiver a lot. Now, it could be Devontae Adams cuts into that a decent amount, which I know you've referenced, but I have Nacua and Adams projected for really strong target shares. I don't think they have to throw to a lot of other guys based on the history of that offense. You get the consolidation, you get a lot of targets because you get a more stationary quarterback, and the range of outcomes for that statistical production is very, very strong. It's a completely different thing. When you look at all the projections, when I look at all the box scores for last year for these different teams, we talked about at the top about Denver and how their routes get spread, and it gets problematic for them from a routes perspective. There are different teams that in different ways, the players don't have a great path to getting to different ceilings, but Denver is not even as concerning because that could consolidate through injury or something as these mobile QB offenses. When you look at them year after year and look at the ways that their seasons end, and you do their projections and you start to play with the volume, you're just like, man, I don't care how good I think this player is. It's really hard for him unless he gets all of the work like Derrick Henry or Saquon Barkley and is very efficient, which they were. It's really, and even still, Shawn, you know as well as I do, the thing that we don't often say is that, I mean, as good as Saquon Barkley was last year, as good as Derrick Henry was last year, they weren't peak Christian McCaffrey. These guys weren't scoring 30 PPR points per game. They weren't even scoring 25. They were really good within the context of the 2024 NFL season, but there could be other running backs. When we talk about like Devon Achane ceiling, that guy can score 27 points per game. Jahmyr Gibbs can score 27 points per game. I don't even think I can project that for Saquon Barkley and Henry, even if they run for 2,000 yards. And so that is a meaningful point as well. Even when they're hitting their massive ceiling, they're not really that true legendary upside. They could be the RB1 in a season if the other players don't hit that true legendary upside. Anyway, I think, and the other huge part of this that I'm coming around to, and I'm going to write into my home league guides and stuff, Shawn, and I mean, we're 2 hours into this podcast. We might as well just give all the goods away, right? I think in your home leagues where there's a lot less pressure on the running backs and the receivers and the players that we really like, you can get them deep. You just have to take one of those 4 elite quarterbacks and probably just take Jaden Daniels. But it's easy to make room for a detour in those softer rooms is what I'm saying. And you've taught me over the years that we're trying to figure out how to play these different offenses. You want to play these offenses through the quarterbacks. They can separate. I know that there's a lot of intriguing late round quarterbacks this year, but even when like Jalen Hurts hit a floor last year, he was QB6 and it was his lowest scoring range in 3 years. And the other 3 that we're referencing were all of the 5 above him. The only other guys up there were who Burrow and Baker Mayfield were the other 2 in the top 6 that beat Hurts. The range of scoring for those players, they're pulled up. I want to play AJ Brown. I want to take Jalen Hurts. I want to play Terry McLaurin to get even better this year. Just draft Jaden Daniels. That just means that Jaden Daniels is going to be that much better if somehow Terry McLaurin is even better. And I don't think you want to stack them. That's why I mentioned the home league. I know in best ball, different conversation, but I don't think you want to stack them. I think you just get your exposure to this offense. This is the thing you kind of taught me. How do we want to get our exposure to different offenses? How are we playing this? I think for those 4 offenses, I want to get my exposure to those offenses through the elite quarterbacks, who I do think, even in the more competitive landscapes, are probably a good play at the 3-4 turn. And just don't play the late round quarterback game because it's really hard to match their elite dual threat ceiling anyway. I don't know.
You're just saying that because, we hit on all of our QB start-sits decisions last year.
Yeah. Our end of year CJ Stroud to Anthony Richardson disaster team. That was fun. That was a fun team.
Only 4 interesting options there. Ben, this has been fantastic. I love how you have wrapped that up for us. That's the perfect conclusion to a really fun exercise working through the projections. It's just, as you mentioned, it's not so much about getting hung up on the projection itself, but trying to understand the teams, trying to understand the players, understanding the player strengths and weaknesses, how those are likely to manifest within the context of what a team does. You've got so much deep information into both the team and the players in terms of what you have done here. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Folks should be subscribed to Stealing Signals so they can get all that. It is Ben Gretch.
Can I just thank you as well as get thank you so much for going through this with me and pointing to so many things. I don't update the projections. I won't be making all those changes I referred to on this show. I may write some of it into something at some point because you noted a ton of things that I would have liked to have had at least a little bit different, but I'm not going to spend several hours. I'm behind on all my writing and stuff. I'm not going to spend several hours tweaking all the projections because I don't care about the outputs of these projections. But for anyone who is subscribed there, it's important to understand that I write this in all the stuff, but it's important to understand the projections are not how I'm ranking the players. I really appreciated your feedback on a lot of that stuff. It helped me crystallize what my projections were actually saying on some of the players, and in some cases why they were potentially wrong or what they were missing in some of the range of outcomes elements. So anyway, thank you for going through that with me. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's so much fun, and I wish we could do 30 hours on this easy. I mean, I'm sure there are teams that we didn't get to that folks would like to hear about. It's not really fair of me to say, let us know what you do think we missed, because it ends up being on Ben or Colin to kind of wrangle that together. But we will cover more pieces of this. Then we've got all kinds of great Stealing Bananas content coming up. We will do more drafts for you, which will hopefully demonstrate how we're incorporating this live into tactics in a variety of formats. We'll be drafting kind of across the board there. Love to have you guys over at RotoViz too. Coupon code RVRadio2025 at checkout for 10% off. Kevin, Blair, and the gang doing a fantastic job. We love you guys. Talk to you soon.